And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I hope that someone gets my message in a bottle. There's so many deep tracks in tonight's special report on COG, UFO, SSP, and deep events that we're going to need some layers and background to give us that functional levels of comprehension as we go here. And there's so much, of course, going on in the world as we speak tonight. So we have a kind of a election update mixed with this COG UFO report and COG in the news. And this is always interesting to me as they've hidden the subject for decades. And now we see it coming out. And I'm going to tell you some very special things about the people who are coming out in favor of replacing Congress with these designates. And this is very interesting because a lot of the people involved in this process who are looking for a constitutional amendment, the 28th constitutional amendment, are directly involved with the false UAP, phony UFO defense and UFO threat narrative. And I'm going to show you exactly who those people are. And I'm also going to show you some very interesting continuity of government people that you haven't heard of. Now, I've been tracking them and in the news and behind the scenes with all the things that they're up to in Congress and in other places, in administrations and media and all the rest. And I keep kind of a map of the various connections that they have, like a lot of researchers do for different subjects. It's not done very much with COG. I'm kind of almost solo in that regard. One of the interesting things about some of these players tonight is I'm going to show you that some of them are in the line of succession to the presidency, even though they haven't been confirmed by the Senate. And this is a huge discrepancy, which has never occurred before in our history, which says to me that just like that scientist clock, when they get around the doomsday clock and they set it up a little closer when we get into tensions with, say, Russia or another country about the possibility, and they move the hand closer to midnight, and then they move it back when things ease up. Well, I do the same thing with COG and how they would call it and bring it into existence. And I can tell you the COG clock has been moving steadily in this election with the assassination attempts and other things. So we're going to get into that tonight. We're also going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. We'll go about 90 minutes with you here tonight. And you can ask Miss Olivia any question that you have in mind and try to keep it show related. And we will be taking those in the last half hour of the show. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up. What do you got out there?
Beth Noya says, is COG running the USA right now?
Well, it's very interesting because there is a void there in the power structure, but the same people who came in with Biden are running the show. So the continuity people have a distinct signature. So I believe they're involved and poised at the ready. But I think what we're seeing now is a weird kind of interim government. And there's definitely something wrong with the Harris-Walz campaign. It's not a normal campaign where they'd be out there swinging the bat for votes. And what's interesting is tonight we're going to get into the fact that it is Liz Cheney who is completely behind Kamala Harris. And that gives you the COG stamp of approval on the Harris-Walz candidacy. Of course, Walz got bedazzled by J.D. Vance in the debate earlier this week, which was a complete disaster for the Democrats and showed just the weirdness of Walz and the whole, I want to shut down free speech, and his own personal strange lies about Tiananmen Square and him being in the middle of it and all this nonsense, which turned out not to be true. And it's good that the debate moderators, the mainstream media moderators brought it up, but they didn't really say to him, why did you lie about it? They just said, can you explain the discrepancy, which I guess is a polite way to go. But Walz was, we're seeing it, his worst there.
He's a liar.
Let's get real. Well, this is the nature of the thing. I mean, if you seriously want to ascend to the presidency, you think you can get away that quickly in a debate with lying and not owning up to it? That's kind of rough. But in any case, the ticket, what was really on display is the extreme, and I mean extreme policies of that Harris-Walz ticket, and it gets worse as we go in there. Of course, I've been discussing two alliances that are involved in this presidency, and how a lot of people who are throwing out the idea that the presidential election doesn't matter and all that are just completely wrong, totally wrong. And it is a very important election, probably the most consequential of my lifetime. And if you're going back, my parents and grandparents, they may have had consequential elections like Kennedy, Nixon, and things like that. But for me, this one is it. And it's very important because you can clearly see in the situation that's gone on with the terrible Helene storm in North Carolina, the responses of the two potential presidents there, Harris and Trump, are just diametrically opposed. Trump was there on day one, trying to beef up supplies, going in directly, doing fundraisers, the whole bit. And Waltz and Biden, Biden was hanging out in Delaware, and Harris was at a fundraiser in Los Angeles. They didn't change anything that they were doing. They let the whole thing sweep in for 72 hours. Massive destruction on a scale we haven't seen in the United States by a hurricane for 55 years. So this is a dramatic turn of events. And the fact that they left that and they abdicated the whole North Carolina piece, and of course that got into Georgia and parts of Florida as well, absolute devastation, and reported to us by viewers and friends alike all throughout the region. And it's an incredible, and I do mean incredible, throwdown going on there. For me, when I look at that situation, it shows clearly the contempt. And when we had Mayorkas, of course, come out, the leader of the Department of Homeland Security with 260,000 employees, completely extra constitutional group, in my opinion, and ridiculously oversized. I mean, what is going on there? But what we have, I think, going on with Mayorkas is he said, well, FEMA's out of money, and so we'll send people of North Carolina $750 while you give $200 billion to Ukraine and Zelensky. And a lot of people have pointed this out. I mean, it's just very clear that you take care of things at home first. And the whole incredible bloated expanse of what they're doing in the Ukraine war and in the Middle Eastern wars just shows the length and the depth of the corruption involved here with the Biden administration. And that's Harris right in the heart of it, and her bizarro sidekick Waltz. Now, they're being very blatant about it. And what's interesting, and I think constitutes maybe one of the weirdest moments, along with the next one, which is Kamala and Cheney, but one of the weirdest moments of this entire campaign is David Axelrod, who ran both of the Obama campaigns for president and is generally, the Democratic operative they go to. He gets on there, and the mainstream media has totally blown off the situation in North Carolina, the massive devastation to families, people drowning, lives ruined by the storm conditions. This guy, Axelrod, gets up there and he says, I think the savvy Democrat voters who are up there in Asheville will still make it to the polls, while the Trump people are going to have problems. There's a kind of sick mentality going on there, not extending any of his own feelings, just thinking, oh, how I can make this work for me. Let me tell you, North Carolina is going to go for Trump, disaster or no disaster. They already were headed that way, which is why, in my opinion, the Democrat governor and the president were completely against going in there and really doing a job to fix things up. They wanted to leave it like it was, and they didn't want to go in there and run normal rescue operations. As a matter of fact, I've been hearing, and this is across the board, that FEMA in many cases has been blocking the direct aid from going in there. So we've seen a lot of stories about this. Let's put this on the record. I won't even touch for now on the weather modification aspects, because they've gone out there. The media try to knock this down immediately and say, oh, weather modification is not a possibility. And there's a weird conspiracy theory going on online. Look, if you go to Lyndon Johnson's speech in 1961, okay, he had got in his VP on the Kennedy ticket after trying to blackmail Kennedy to get on the ticket and then assuming the presidency later on the assassination of Kennedy. Let's remember who was talking about here. But Johnson, there's a whole university speech where he talks about weather modification and how he who controls the weather will control the world. And he understood the tools of weather modification. There are papers in the late 60s about it. And then William Cohen, who was a Republican, but he was the defense secretary under President Clinton in 1998, speaking before a Senate committee, talked about weather modification weapons. So we know that they exist. Now, whether or not they were used is a legitimate question, but the fact that they exist is not on the table. We know that they exist. That's a fact. So there's no mainstream media outlet, that can say, oh, this is just some crazy conspiracy that got cooked up. Of course, they've been doing cloud seeding. They know how to manipulate weather modification on a dramatic scale across the board. So let's get real about that. We're all on the same page there. We know what the government can do. Come on. Now, in the case of North Carolina, more information needs to come in about how this may have happened. So, so let's say that we don't know for sure that weather modification was used. Very well could have been, but nonetheless, it's a disaster for the people that are there. And that's the important thing. And FEMA saying we're out of money and can't do anything while giving all this money to the illegals that they're hoarding here through the border, which is insane. And it's very interesting because a report came out. I just was looking at it. Now, this is a Yale report. You can't get more liberal than Yale. And you had 3 liberals on the report and 2 sort of moderate type centrists. Their estimate for illegal immigration in the United States is 22 million. So 22 million citizens here illegally. And, the system has always been geared to pick up a certain amount of illegal activity, but you can't lay those types of numbers. And most of those numbers have kicked in the last 3 years under Biden-Harris. It's just very clear. Of course, under Trump's policy, there is a difference. You see, that's why the black pill people are wrong. That's why the people who show up in my threads and, they say, oh, none of this presidential stuff matters. Part of that is an op, let's face it, because there's some stubborn quality where they can't see the difference between the Trump-Kennedy alliance and the Kamala-Cheney alliance. This is the key thing. I'm going to point this out to you in pictures. You got a choice at the ballot box on November 5th. That's one alliance, Trump and Kennedy, okay? They want to seal the border. They want to keep free speech going. And they also have a number of different policies that relate directly to the Constitution.
And make America healthy again.
Right, make America maha. But that alliance is crucial because it covers 2 ends of the spectrum, and they're both coming from a populist point of view and going back to the work of the citizenry. No, you're not going to get anything on a presidential or a congressional level that's perfect. What you have to do is not make the perfect the enemy of the good. And over again, we've seen the black pill people say stupid things that are very immature. Now, this is the alliance on the other side. All right, that's your alliance on the other ticket. It's Cheney, torture man Cheney, Iraq war, all the dead people from the Iraq war, Kamala Harris, completely vacant, and a puppet of the Chinese Communist government, etc. This is your choice. So there is a very important difference. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. The importance this year is huge. If you didn't believe me, well, Liz Cheney comes out and the New York Times is saluting it. A steely Liz Cheney at Harris's side calls it our duty to reject Trump and make sure that COG carries on through Harris and Waltz, the crazy communist insurgent. The former Congresswoman and Republican exile stumped for Kamala Harris in Wisconsin, the birthplace of the GOP, calling on conservatives to shun Donald Trump's depraved cruelty. Yeah, depraved cruelty, like the torture of civilians guaranteed under the Cheney-Bush administration. Let's not forget the torture memos, which were authored by Dick Cheney. We know that Cheney knows all about cruelty, but there they are, and it's a new day in America with Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris. Now, even the most cynical person would have to ask themselves a question, do I feel lucky? And, when you're dealing with an alliance of Cheney and Harris on one end and an alliance of Trump and RFK on the other, what's the more significant one for the country to move forward? Liz Cheney to campaign with Harris at the birthplace of the GOP. This is the alliance on the other side. And that is the kind of sickness going on in the Democrat Party. They've completely folded. They are now under the power of COG. There's no question in my mind. Cheney is the author of the new version of COG and activated it on 9/11. If you want the continuity of government player in the middle of this election, it's Dick Cheney through his daughter, Liz Cheney, supporting Harris. There's no question in my mind. And we're going to get into why that continuity of government is now on alert status. And we're also going to bring in the UFO file in relationship to this. It's going to go deep, and we're going to be ready for it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is COG UFO SSP deep event. And look, I've talked about the October surprise, and it very well may be that it's the emergency powers that ends up being the October surprise. The other piece, of course, that they could do is elevate Harris to the presidency. As we know, we've seen some very vacant moments with Stepford Biden of late, and they're letting him out there a little bit. They're actually letting him out there more than Kamala Harris, which it's going to tell you what's going on in their mind on the Kamala side. They will not let her take any real questions. But he's been saying weird things. They're like, what are you going to do about the storm center and the distribution of funds? And he's like, what storm? Oh, the one I was just surveying? This is pretty out of it. And it's funny because he showed up in the media briefing room today, and he was like, hi, everyone, my name's Joe Biden. And I was like, heh. Meanwhile, you have all these people in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee. That is abdication. And this is something that, remember, almost got George Bush W impeached because of his response to Katrina. And it certainly damaged that party for a number of years, and it should. But these people, the media thinks they can play a whole protection thing on the disaster and the lack of response in the case of the Helene storm. And I'm telling you, you can't. They don't have enough of a hold on free speech to hold that down. People talk, and so far we do not have the complete draconian control. We're censored hardcore, no question, especially this show. Make no mistake about it. But this is already getting out that people's lives have been destroyed, and the media is like, oh yeah, we think there's 150 to 200 people that no. The numbers are much, much higher than that. Okay. So this is a disaster, and they think they can hide it. And what they're trying to do is introduce false, and I mean false, economic boosting reports so they can talk about that instead. For example, they came out with these numbers of, first of all, the Fed chair. Okay. He comes out and he says, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to decrease the interest rate. Now, when you're the Fed chair, you don't do that during an election year. Classically, when presidents have asked them to do that, they always come back and have said, like Alan Greenspan in 1992 to Bush 1, I can't do that. That's election interference. And it's right, because if you change things on the economic front and it boosts the stock market temporarily, you're rigging it to make it look better than it is just for the sake of the election. So everyone knows the disaster of an economy that this has been. And so the New York Times has been trying to, they were like, Senator found in 20-year-old video with blackface, And look, no one cares about this guy's insensitivity 20 years ago. They care about people dying, and they care about the storm reaction, and they care about the fact that you're giving more attention to illegal immigrants that you hope to turn into voters and maybe an army inside the country. So it's, if anything, this is just exposing who these people are. And like I said, it's not even a Democrat party anymore. One of the things that Bobby Kennedy put on the record recently is he said they've become the party of Dick Cheney, and Dick Cheney is COG. He's the architect of COG, the modern version. So you're looking at the continuity of government party, and that's their ultimate trick because they will not have a majority. And this is the nature of their problem going forward. Just like Trudeau, just like Macron, all these people do not have a governing majority. They're down in the 20s and 30s in terms of their popularity level. They need emergency powers, and that's all there is to it. And we're going to see what they're going to do with those emergency powers as well as we get into it tonight. And like I mentioned, we're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program. I also want to say that, and just a quick reminder, that if you're new here, sign up for the Dark Journalist newsletter. It's a free newsletter at darkjournalist.com, and it lets you know about the amazing shows that we have coming up for you. X-series episodes, great interviews, things you will not see anywhere, documentaries that will blow your mind. This documentary that we put out, Hacking Atlantis, we have a very important, this got a great response, and we have a very important follow-up to this coming up, along with our docu-series on Kennedy and Lloyd Berkner. This is the kind of hardcore stuff that you get access to being part of that membership and letting you know about the incredible thing. This one right now, we've put up and out there for free for everyone. And, you know, the docu-series, these are very important kind of, they're consolidations, and we're letting out information that we haven't put on the record yet. So this is really where it's at, and we have a first-class production team working on those. For me, you know, these are the types of things you get access to. The other thing is you want to make sure that you cut through the noise of the kind of censorship that we've been seeing on a regular basis. And, you know, on a regular basis, people send me emails and things being like, I searched Dark Journalists, and, you know, it comes up, Lou Elizondo kills up, you know. So the cream of the jest, as it were. But in any case, keep it up and go directly. Make sure you're on that newsletter list. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Good. David Termina says, let's not forget Cheney ran an assassination program as well. He called Trump the most dangerous man to the republic in U.S. history. Seems like a prime suspect in any investigation.
Yeah. Now, here's an interesting thing that not a lot of people are aware of, which is there's a dramatic crossover with Cheney and the UFO file, which isn't talked about very much. And a lot of the S4 whistleblowers from the 90s reported that as defense secretary, he was very involved with the secrecy there. When questioned about this on a radio talk show program, he said, maybe I was, but if it was classified, I'm not going to talk to you about it, in his usual arrogant stance. There's no question that Cheney was deeply involved. The crossover here with the continuity of government program, the UFO file, and what we've called the secret space program, which has been bandied about by all sorts of clowns at Gaia TV, but nonetheless, the core aspect of the secret space program shows up in what we've seen with the Elon Musk privatization of space, peace, and all the rest. They've been working there on a regular basis in space, developing an infrastructure with our money and with our, you know, kind of support for that infrastructure. What's interesting to me is when you take the fact that we had the last manned mission to the moon in 1972. By the way, we're supposed to go, Artemis is supposed to go in November to the moon. I don't know how that's going on schedule. They're probably going to boot that into 25 or 26, but supposedly that's what they're supposed to do, and land on the moon for the first time. But that represents a difference now of 52 years. What have you done in the meantime? If you had a manned space program, what happened to it? Well, the last vestiges of that manned space program blew up in smithereens in the Challenger explosion during the 1980s with Ronald Reagan as president. And that was the manned space program, remember, is Kennedy's vision. So that was the end of that. That's getting rid of the whole Kennedy vision around that. And Kennedy comes into tonight's talk as well, because Kennedy, remember, the root, what we're looking at with the deep events and the continuity of government play, how it gets into that level of secrecy is quite important. So we're going to start off with levels of secrecy and how it's affected policy. one of the key things in my own research was about a case, the Aztec, New Mexico UFO case, which has always been under a very heavy program of disinformation by the FBI and the CIA from its outset. But in fact, when I looked into it, had the best witnesses, the best scientists, and I found a huge crossover between Silas Newton, who's involved in that story, and Thomas Jerome Newton, who's the man who fell to earth, the central character of the Walter Tevis novel, which became the movie that Bowie was in. It's very interesting, and also the fact that that movie, The Man Who Fell to Earth, was filmed in Roswell, New Mexico, far before anyone knew anything about Roswell. Because remember, the story of Roswell came out in 1947 and then was buried 3 days later. There's no talk of it in 50s and 60s books and 70s books. You don't hear anything about it again until 1980, when Marcel, the intelligence officer who was the first man on the spot, he was the one who gave the story to Stanton Friedman. And then Friedman was able to round up all the witnesses. But in that period between, nobody heard anything about it. Well, oddly enough, in the middle of all this, there's a movie called 7 Days in May, and I've pointed out the graphic where they have a COG commander who's taken over and taken it upon himself to launch missiles. And it's interesting because over his shoulder, you can see Roswell, New Mexico on one of the maps. So there's a lot of inside things in that movie. And if you go into the history of that movie, you're going to find that JFK worked very closely with the director, John Frankenheimer, to make sure they had access to the White House, briefing documents, all kinds of things. And he said, quote, people in the behind the scenes, people needed to understand exactly what goes on. So, that's the threat of the COG aspect. And we've lived with it as kind of a parallel system operating next to us. And it's very interesting because I've always wondered about the difference between the deep state and the continuity of government program. And I found a quote in Professor Scott's work which sums up the difference between the two. And I'm going to read that quote as well tonight. Before I jump in, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Well, Gigi and Mr. Wolf are
excellent.
in the chat, and I just wanted to say, Mr. Wolf just brought tears to my eyes. He said, "I can't describe how comfortable the feeling is to be here watching DJ after a week of hell."
Oh my God. Well, it's incredible. And I have to say, the things that Gigi has been through being in North Carolina and going through this, absolutely amazing. And, the fact of actually living through this experience and seeing all that, and also being on the ground, is a great resource for all of us about it. I have to say also, in a time like this, get behind the people who are doing the work. So please go to gigiyoung.com, make sure you're there and supporting the incredibly important work that she does. And remember, if you enjoy things here on the X series, then, Gigi's an incredible contributor to that as a guest, as somebody who, generates ideas and opens up a whole avenue to so many of these subjects. And we're just incredibly lucky that she's got through this experience, and we want to hear more about what took place there. It's amazing to me also because what I've been hearing from people who were in that part of North Carolina, that this happened so quickly. There was no time to prepare for it. And just the level of devastation and how things we take for granted on a regular basis, running water, gasoline, electricity, all that is just gone.
Roads.
In a heartbeat. Yeah. I mean, you have to imagine the level of this. So that level of preparation and the kind of networks that people form around this, absolutely essential. And you can see it up close. It was very interesting because I had a conversation with Dr. Farrell last month about some of the storms that hit in the area where he is located. And it's just amazing the level of extreme weather that we're seeing. And, it has nothing to do with the traditional climate change model. It is just the fact that these things are taking place. And we need to, when the Casey work, for example, talks about earth changes, there's no question in my mind that weather is a part of that. And when you go deep into those readings, you're going to find the weather conditions for the Atlanteans turned tumultuous because those things are all related. After all, the fires in the earth, as it were. But on a very human level, and a very straight ahead kind of waking up, and finding your entire community is devastated or your house is gone, we have to kind of really get a glimpse of that and let it be a wake up call for us. And I think, again, when it comes moving it to the presidential race, seeing the response on the part of the two candidates gives you everything you need to know. And I think the current government's response to that, the Biden administration and Harris and all the rest of the bozos that are up there, absolutely revealing their it's not incompetence, it's contempt, and it's putting Buttigieg out there with him saying, don't go in there as a private person and offer any aid. Well, sorry, buddy. People are going to do it, and they don't care about you and your bizarro freak show, or how they try to put you up there as the first gay candidate or whatever. That has nothing to do with anything. This is about people and communities, and not the psycho Biden administration. And that Biden administration is going to go off as, we're going to look back on it as one of the worst things that ever happened in America, period. And it's a complete joke, and that ticket needs to be defeated come November 5th. I'm entirely committed to it. I don't care about any black pill people saying nothing matters. Make sure you're against everything. And, there was one of these guys who showed up in some of my Twitter threads. He had just started this thing. It's like independent media organization or something like that. And his whole thing was, he couldn't get around the fact that, and like whoever wants to vote for whoever they want to, it doesn't play into how I think of them. But this idea that you can't do anything and that voting makes no sense and all the rest of it is stupid. Look at this election. Look at the people who were involved. Look at their reactions in a real emergency. Ask yourself honestly, regardless if you're a Republican, Democrat, Green Party, it doesn't matter. Would you rather have Trump in office and the Trump RFK alliance in office, or would you rather have this Harris Waltz Cheney freak show? Really ask the question. And, go back to blackpilling after the election's over. When I look at it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is COG UFO SSP, deep events, and we're going deep here tonight. It's just a special report, so we'll be with you here about another hour or so. We'll take another question.
I just wanted to say, Jim Roy, his brother is out there around Asheville and says, my brother says the worst part is no power. The best part is people helping the people. The goodness in people overpowers the evil. And we're hearing amazing stories about that. The self-sacrifice.
Oh my God. Well, you also have to realize in an event like this, like all the things that they do in society to divide people is ridiculous. Fundamentally, people can support each other. And what they've been trying to do with manipulating people, and the fact that the government has actually stopped aid from coming in, tells you everything you need to know about how out of touch.
Or taking credit for aid that isn't theirs. That's the other thing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have the quote. I'm going to read this from Mayorkas. And remember, Mayorkas has facilitated the invasion of the southern border. So, and Homeland Security is an extra constitutional agency. So whoever they got to run it would be running an extra constitutional agency. But I think they have to get a certain level of corruption to run that. Now, how do you get rid of Homeland Security? That much infrastructure, 260,000 people. Well, both the Central Intelligence Agency and Homeland Security are extra constitutional. So a president can technically get rid of them because they serve at the pleasure of the president. So I think there should be a move to eliminate both. And what Kennedy wanted to do back in 1963 is quite interesting. And you can see it in what we've talked about on this program, which is a presidential proclamation, SM-57. He wanted to take all the paramilitary work of the CIA and bring it back to the Joint Chiefs, which means it's more accountable under the military than it is under this weird runaway thing, which was formed out of Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, connected to international media in Manhattan and international finance. So you'd see it's a pretty dramatic switch that took place with the National Security Act in 1947. We may need here, coming in to the 250th anniversary of America to take a look at that and say, look, a lot of people have looked at that and said that's the nature of the problem. The secrecy is right in the heart of that. And where did it really kick in? It kicked in heavily in 1947 with the advent of the secrecy around the UFO file and the development of the continuity of government program. So those two things are heavily, heavily linked. And when you get into that secret space program and the infrastructure in space, how did they do it? How did you get that kind of secrecy in space? All you have to do is say the thousands of underground bases that they had, and they developed first legitimately to survive a nuclear war, but eventually became an entire underground compound, a separate government, in fact, with no checks and balances. All you have to do is flip the script from that underground infrastructure into space and say, well, the same risks go for us in space, so we don't have to be accountable to anyone up there either. That's a good way. These three acronyms are going to help us, and that's UFO, SSP, and COG, because it's going to help us understand how they're linked. They've been developed in very different places. You have deep state researchers who brought forward the continuity of government research. They're not interested at all in the UFO file, and I don't blame them because of the way it's been presented. However, the UFO file is very important, absolutely crucial in the middle of all this, and I'm going to show you how tonight. And so bringing those things together, you'll get an understanding of the secret space program. Those three acronyms are going to guide us through revealing that secrecy as we go. But just that quick piece on Mayorkas. Calm before the storm. Feds say there's no money left for hurricanes after it spent $1.4 billion on immigrants. Now, there's no getting around it. This is the thing that they're doing, which is they're spending money on this program to bring in people who are going to wipe out the safety net system. So now you have to be able to talk about this. I'm sure there have been times in our country when there was a xenophobia about immigration, but we've always done well with immigration in this country. What's interesting is they made a decision in 1924 that all the different parties that they brought in, Italians, Irish, Jews, French, all of these different groups needed time to assimilate and become one culture while retaining their own identity. And so they ceased from 1924 to 1965 in the United States any large-scale immigration of any kind. They might have imported selected scientists and things like that, but they did not have a regular immigration program. It wasn't until 1965 that they kicked it back in. And, as a result of that 40 years, we got a tremendous blending. What you're seeing now is a tremendous balkanization of these different groups, and that leads to disorder, it leads to dissent, and it's the kind of chaos that somebody is paying for. Think about it. They're paying for it with our money, and then they're turning around and telling our citizens we don't have it because we gave it over to this thing. They know very well how to seal the border. Trump demonstrated how to do it. Biden knew how to do it. He got rid of all of Trump's executive orders at the border as soon as he got in. So they know what they've been up to. And when people ask why, very often the idea comes back, well, if they could just get these 20 some odd million illegal immigrants to vote Democrat, which more than likely they would, since that's the policy, they'd have 20 million new voters and guarantee them majorities forever. I can see that, but I think the plan goes a lot deeper. And we'll get into some of how that works here tonight as we go into COG, UFO, and SSP. Now, we started off, we saw the Cheney alliance with Harris. So we see how that works together. A little overview on COG here. Continuity of government program was started under Harry Truman, and it was expanded gigantically under President Eisenhower. They figured fundamentally, if the government was decapitated by a nuclear strike, you'd need an entire apparatus underneath. One of the things they did in that development was they created something called the Doomsday Network. The Doomsday Network was a communications network that couldn't be hacked into. You couldn't listen to it with a phone line. You couldn't intercept its radio waves. And that communication network showed up in a series of deep events in America that changed policy and changed the culture, all the way from the Kennedy assassination through 9/11 the financial coup of 2008 and ultimately the COVID op. So we have it running the 60-year course. And the Doomsday Network is very interesting because it shows up in unusual ways. I put something up on Twitter today, which was the original uh, Oliver North Iran-Contra hearings. And right in the middle there's a congressman who said, hey, there's this Miami article about Oliver North running the continuity of government program, and they're going to suspend the Constitution. Like, what is this thing? And you see all the senators and lawyers flip out, jump up, and they say, you can't mention that. You can't mention it. This thing has been around with us for a long time, and it wasn't raised in public, actually, until the 2020 election. And they definitely had plans to implement this, because before they thought about the whole thing with the election, they were looking at Trump and saying, maybe, he gets COVID and then we kind of get him out of the way by implementing COG, and we'll see what we're going to do with him. But, and you can see some very interesting footsteps and footprints of this after the election results. That Trump goes in there and he fires people like the defense secretary, which is very odd because their tenure only has 2 months left anyway. Well, there were some odd moments there in October of 2020. And some of those moments would lead one to reflect on the fact that Trump became very aware that they were going to implement the continuity of government. The last 2 months of President Trump's administration is quite fascinating. In fact, one of the things we pointed out is that he implemented John Kennedy's SM-57 national, the NSAM-57, National Security Action Memo. This is a very important memo that I referenced about stripping the power away from the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, this thing was supposed to be activated January 8th, and I'm sure when Biden caught in on the 20th, they just snuffed it out. It never got a chance to do anything. But Kennedy gave that to the Joint Chiefs after the whole Bay of Pigs fiasco with the CIA and firing those people. And they took a look at it and they said, okay, we're putting this on the shelf because we'll have a ground war with the CIA over this. Just forget about it. And they did not implement a presidential directive. It's hung around and sat around on the books. The person who brought it to light was Fletcher Prouty, who was the intermediary between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA at the time, had all the inside info. And as soon as the Kennedy assassination happened, started to wonder why he had been sent by his superior officer to Antarctica. So he wouldn't be around during this whole thing. So little pieces of the puzzle started to dawn on him about what had taken place, and he put the puzzle together that, in fact, his superior was involved in the assassination, and he didn't want nosy Prouty to be there in the middle, seeing what was really going on, or setting up security, for example, for President Kennedy in Dallas. So the roots of this thing take us into an interesting place. And I have a quote from Fletcher Prouty, in fact, that gets us to the UFO file. And this is where I think the deep state researchers can find crossover with the UFO file researchers. And that's going to really reveal some of these plans. While I find it, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Lois says, DJ, what are the borders for COG? I recall the zone includes the US, Canada, and Mexico. Is that right?
Well, COG is, that's the NORAD setup, the homeland, that whole piece. But continuity of government is set up for the United States. And what they did was the reason COG went from the Eisenhower underground bases piece to the Reagan, Rex 84 will round up citizens who are dissidents in the case of an emergency. And then Oliver North, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. And Cheney and Rumsfeld were out of government at the time. Rumsfeld was, in fact, he was the CEO of a chemical company and a pharmaceutical company. So this is an interesting thing that needs to be understood about COG. It takes corporate people, it takes media people, it takes influencers. I mean, it's not just a government program. It seeps into every aspect of society, in fact. But one of the things I think that we look at is the zones. What happens immediately is the person who ascends as the COG combatant commander of the United States, That is General Gio. Now, I've pointed out Gio has a UFO file connection as well. This is Gio. Now, he's the Northcom commander, and I've pointed out the Northcom commander, the NORAD commander, and the COG commander are all the same person. They made it some triple threat position. Now, in the event that they called continuity of government, let's just imagine this. Now, I don't certainly I don't wish for a scenario like this. So when I go through some of these scenarios, they are to raise our awareness about them. It's not a doom scrolling doomsday outline, but seeing how they use the emergency powers and how an emergency comes up, they use this as an excuse. Professor Scott has a great observation that sometimes when they're doing trainings on things, just like when they were during 9/11 doing trainings about terrorists flying planes into buildings, that was the name of the test, something piggybacks on the back of the training and makes it go live, makes the op go real, as it were. So we have to keep that in mind as we go along here. So what happens is Gio, he becomes the COG combatant commander. He's the total ruler of the United States. And what he does, he sets up the regional government. This is how it actually plays out. So it's completely suspends the Constitution. It's complete martial law, and it's insanity, right? It makes him basically the dictator. Now, what happens with him is he sets up zones and he appoints regional governors. So for the Eastern region, New England and all this stuff, there's one regional governor for that. For the Southwest, there's another regional governor, and they answer to him. And the idea, what's in the statute for continuity of government, is that they set this up until such time as they can have safe enough conditions to run an election. Well, ask Egypt how that's working out. They had a military overthrow in 2011. Have they run any elections since then? I don't think so. Let's ask our friends in the Ukraine, how are those elections going? Well, there are no elections because you have some guy in there who's in emergency perpetuity because he's fighting Russia, So the nature is once they seize that power, they'll never give it back for any purpose. So we can never allow this super constitutional structure to show up. But they have plans, and what it takes to trigger the plan is on the level of category. It used to be just nuclear, and what happened is Cheney and Rumsfeld came along with Bush in the late 80s and changed it. And then when W. Bush in 2007 was setting it up, looking forward to leaving office in 2008, he went in deep and gave it even more conditions. For example, any emergency they could pull out COG for. So they were looking forward to things like COVID. They were looking forward to these other types of emergencies that they could get into. So you can imagine a huge cyber crisis, a gigantic cyber hack of monetary systems, a nuclear event could do it, or a UFO threat, for example. Now, they've been raising the UFO threat very interestingly in the public of late. I have a couple of stories here going back to, again, trying to get this whole piece activated about a threat. Now, they've been running around these CIA people. I've pointed them out for a few years now. Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon. They've been the ones on the talk shows with the books and all that, talking about a UFO threat and how they're whistleblowers and, they risk their lives in order to do that. In the background, we've been seeing little indications that the media is trying to set up conditions for the Constitution to go away. The New York Times has done a series of these, but the New Yorker magazine came out and said it the most blatantly. Is it time to torch the Constitution? How about that? Just your editorial. Oh, let's just get rid of that Constitution. Some scholars say it's to blame for our political dysfunction and that we need to start over. Oh, yeah. You really want Harrison Waltz to write the Constitution going forward. Good idea. So, but this has been a very steady stream of breadcrumbs coming in, laying a foundation of some kind. Oh, let's get rid of that Constitution. That's what the problem is. not the fact that there's this deep state structure running everything. So they can easily work through the media to get that type of message out, where people are like, oh yeah, get rid of that Constitution. I could go along with that. Now, in the middle of all this, while they're talking about axing the Constitution, we hear all these things about the UFO threat again. Now, they laid in heavy. In 2023 was one of the most extreme years for the UFO threat. And they had the whistleblower Grush. We have the whole saga with Grush and Mellon that I've talked about in this program. And so they did all that, and they had congressional hearings and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, they didn't reveal anything new. At the end of the day, they tried to push a UFO threat again and create a wing of UFO celebrities who are all CIA agents, counterintel agents, or NRO people. So the Military Times came out with this: did F-22 shoot down a UFO? Photo of aerial object adds to mystery. Now, they released, you might remember in February 2023, they had this Northcom commander, Van Herk, who was the previous commander before Geo took over. He came out and he said, oh, we shot down UFOs. We don't know if they were extraterrestrial, which is completely ridiculous. They knew it would set off a firestorm if they did it, but they wanted those headlines. They got the data back. They did a lot of data mining from the response, and they figured out, I see what's going on here. This is what we can do. This is what we can do. This now, after the whole Chinese balloon incident, there were a series of strange objects that got shot down over Yukon and Alaska. And they finally released a picture of what they shot down over Canada. This is weird kind of donut-shaped UFO, which we've seen that before. Leads me to believe that we're creating those. Now, it's very interesting to me because they released that picture after holding it for a year. And they also held on to the Chinese balloon footage and all the rest of it. So there was something strange going on in the middle of that. This picture, which was a UFO picture from a civilian from Scotland in 1990, wasn't released until last year. That's the picture. So there's something about this picture that they did want to hold on to and make sure it didn't get out there. But the other one, okay, they held on to it for a year, but they kind of didn't mind that it got out there. Remember all the phony stuff that Lou Elizondo came out with in the New York Times and all that, the Tic Tac and all that nonsense. Those have been debunked by a number of different people. So whatever they were doing there, they wanted those out there. And as a matter of fact, if you search for UFO image now, you're going to get rows and rows of this ridiculous grainy Tic Tac thing. We really got this. Now, the New York Times said it's real, so it's all okay. Now, what's funny is a number of researchers, myself included, have gone through that article. That article now is completely, and I mean completely and thoroughly debunked. And I want to say this because the CIA counterintelligence agent who came out and snowed the public using counterintelligence tactics at the behest of Christopher Mellon, the billionaire DOD guy who's driving this process. He came out and he said, I left because they weren't telling the truth. I left the government and here I am. I went back and checked with my own sources and found out that he never left the government. And then I said, he hasn't left the government. Let him come on this program and let somebody ask him, are you not working for the government now? And he, of course, avoided me. I expected that. But in every other interview that he had, they were all softball questions. Oh, well, And then finally at The Intercept, they said, are you working for the government? Someone finally got him pinned down and he said, yes, but it's not what you think. All right. So that whole story.
And that was the end of that?
Yeah. That whole story. They keep raising him. So that the basic PR pitch is, this is a whistleblower. He left the government because he was so upset about how they were hiding UFOs. Now he also was in charge of this program. He was the leader and he couldn't stand it. He's like the king of transparency, King Lou. Now, the story was a lie. 1, he worked for the government the whole time. 2, the story was invented. Mellon and Elizondo worked and invented the whole story, and they rolled it out, and then they try to roll out other whistleblowers. And one of the other ones that they had a problem with was David Grush. especially when he came and talked to me. That was part of the end of the Grush shop. They're going to come out with a Grush book now. And I felt bad for Grush because they used him. He couldn't see it. But they had spooked him and said, you can't go on DJ's show. And he told me that Chris Mellon told him directly, you can't, whatever you do, you're not doing that. So once I put that out publicly, that became a big problem for them. And it caused them to come out of their hiding, their usual like PR points, and basically act pretty mental online. Everybody saw that. And the nature of the thing is, when you just boil it down and forget about, me being involved in it, the whole point is this. They rolled out a false operation. The false operation was that this guy had UFO info, wanted to get it to the public, and then that he was part of a secret UFO team and all this stuff. As people dug into it, they found, one, that the program that he mentioned that he was a leader of, he said, I led the ATIP program. The program didn't exist. That's one. Two, what did exist was a program called OSAP, which he tried to rename for his own purposes and said, well, it wasn't the funded program, but it was some activity I was doing. And then later, now when he comes out in interviews, he doesn't say, oh, I led this ATIP program. He said, I worked with other people on an ATIP program. So, the lies have been moved back, and he's been able to tap dance because nobody knows enough about the subject. Comedy Central is not going to be able to ask this guy the right questions. And unfortunately, I've made the point about this before, that some of the people who are coming into what would be the alternative media space, who come from this high ranking, like Fox News thing, like the Tucker Carlson types. Although Tucker Carlson does good work in other areas, a lot of these people don't know anything about UFOs. That's just the nature of the fact. So when they had Tucker on Joe Rogan, he was like, oh yeah, we're edgy. We talk about UFOs. He goes, I have my friend Lou Elizondo on speed dial right here. So these guys think that they're getting the UFO facts from CIA counterintelligence people. All right, they're not. Okay, Megyn Kelly is not getting CIA counterintel facts. They're not going to get UFO disclosure from CIA people. It's never going to happen. So, and this group has proven themselves publicly. So it's very important with the push around the book Imminent that they're doing with Elizondo and setting him up again. And if you read the story and the way that it's put out there and all the different interviews, we had this too with the PBD broadcast. He brought Lou on. He didn't know the questions to ask him. Again, they let him get away with this idea that he's a disgruntled whistleblower who came out because he had to do this because, damn it, that government, they need to give us the truth. Oh, wait, I still work for the government. All right, so let's get clear about that. But it is important because that UFO push through this entity of the Central Intelligence Agency and the whole intel, the NRO and the NSA are involved in this also. That whole entity is trying to put up a UFO threat aspect. There's no question in my mind. And it's very important how it crisscrosses with the emergency threat. And I'm going to get into how in the next part of this segment coming up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is COG UFO SSP, the deep event. And we are going to get into deep events and what they are. We're going to take your questions here momentarily. And let's say we go for another 40 minutes with you here tonight. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what have you got?
Humanarum says the DoD just recently began distributing an extremely detailed UAP/UFO quote reference guide to local law enforcement agencies as part of something called quote Major Cities Chiefs Organization.
Yeah, that is interesting. You see them being able to try to normalize this thing by calling it UAP. That repackaging is very much like Homeland. And I've said this before, when you call something, you can change the attributes of the thing that you're talking about. And so they spent so many years debunking UFOs that they realized they're in a quandary if they start promoting it outright. So they've come up with the UAP term, and the UAP term is just bad marketing, literally bad marketing. It doesn't mean anything. The other problem is they've realized it doesn't sell as well because people know UFOs. There have been 70 years on the record of movies, comic books, real books, stories, the whole bit. And so, you can't just throw in this thing but it gives them the legitimacy to be like, oh, we can get funding from here. We can be respectable government agency. Now, what I want to say is that they've attached the UFO Defense Office to the National Defense Authorization Act. That's how we got Arrow. Now, they try to put in a UAP amendment to the current one for 2025. And something very unusual happened. Although last year they were blackmailed into it because it held up the funding unless everyone went along with it, this year, Rand Paul was able to stop them from adding the UAP amendment in there. I found that very interesting, and now I want to know what Rand Paul knows about the false UFO threat, because this is a guy who doesn't want to see us waste money, in foreign wars or wars with other entities, shall we say. Let's go a little further down that track. I want to, as part of the stuff I'm talking about tonight, I want to introduce personnel. Now, I've watched a lot of the activities of the personnel, the continuity of government program. I've also tried to see where they place people. One of the people that I've been keeping an eye on that is related to this, to me, is someone who I think has a very unusual role right now, in that she's the acting labor secretary. She was never confirmed. And so a number of stories have come out about this Julie Su, and her parents were Chinese immigrants, and she, studied here at Harvard, and was a very distinguished woman and all the rest of it. But she became the right-hand woman for Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who during the COVID crisis wanted to call martial law and said he could. No, governor, you can't. So what happened was she got involved with the disbursement of funds around COVID, acting as the labor secretary for California. And they discovered there were a lot of problems, including the fact that $60 billion had been given out in fraudulent means to individuals under the unemployment program and to businesses under the COVID reimbursement program. 60 billion with a B in a state. This is not on a federal level. She was right at the heart of giving away that money. So what happens? She's in real trouble. Biden grabs her and says, "You're going to be my labor secretary." It's very unusual. Well, let me tell you, even the Democrats, they know when they have problems. They would not go along with it. Joe Manchin said, there's no way I'm going to let this woman in as labor secretary. So they say, it's not going to happen. You're not getting in as labor secretary. So Biden says, I'll just keep renominating her. You guys don't have to confirm her. Eventually, you're going to have to. They say, we're not going to do it. What does he do next? Very strangely, and for the first time in history, Stepford Biden adds this unconfirmed acting secretary of labor to the presidential succession list, which has never been done before in history. Well, Republicans in Congress noticed that pretty quick. Republicans are furious that labor secretary is in line of presidential succession. Here's why. She's not the labor secretary. She's never been confirmed. So here we have somebody grabbed out of a scandalous situation in California, put in the presidential list of succession, but she's not been approved for anything. She's just Stepford Biden's, rescue operation. Now, in the line of succession, she's pretty far down there, but she shouldn't be on it at all. And if you go through that list, of course, you'll get the Secretary of State, you'll get a number of people far before her. But this is how the continuity of government players move their people into position. Now, she might be somebody who is just a low-level labor official that they're using for this stuff. And how they position people, sometimes it may be overt, sometimes it may be covert. We don't know if she knows anything about the continuity of government program. But what I can tell you is it's never been done before that you have somebody who has not been cleared and confirmed by the Senate into the presidential succession list. Instant red flag. Now, there's a series of things that go down there in relation to Julie Su. And what happens is she gets questioned the third time around. She's brought up for confirmation. They've rejected her already a couple of times. Republicans last week at a Senate committee hearing, Senator Katie Britt of Alabama grilled Su. Do you believe that if the need were to arise, that you are currently eligible to assume the presidency after the Presidential Succession Act? Remember, she's just a weird selection by Biden. She's not confirmed by anybody. Su responded, Senator, it is the honor of a lifetime to have been nominated by the presidency to serve in this cabinet. Absolutely, Britt said. And do you believe that you were in the line of presidential succession? Su noted that prior to being nominated as secretary last year, she was confirmed by the Senate in 2021 as deputy secretary. Then when my predecessor left, I became the acting secretary through the normal, she said, as Britt pressed her point. I'm aware, and my question, Britt said, is, do you believe that you should be in the presidential line of succession? It's just a simple yes or no. Su would not say yes or no. Quote, I mean, Senator, I put it this way. I serve at the pleasure of the president. I appreciate his confidence in me. We spent some time here today talking about the work of the department and the important ways that we are. Britt tried again. Do you believe, yes or no, that you should be, having not been confirmed by the Senate, to this position by the United States Senate? So just yes, you believe you should be able to succeed in the presidential line of succession if that were to ever happen, or no, you believe that you actually are not in that line of succession? Su would not say, and Britt finally gave up. But Britt closed with this. I thought that would be really easy yes or no, and to me, it's no. You haven't been confirmed, and therefore you should not be in the line of succession. End of quote. Of course she shouldn't be. She isn't confirmed for anything. And yet, here is this character coming out of a scandalous situation in California and being installed by Stepford Biden. And again, no accountability, but she's in the presidential succession list. Nobody voted her in for that. Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su vows to remain in the job even as confirmation prospects dim. She's just going to stay there, and the Biden administration is going to keep her in the presidential succession line. This, to me, is placement, and there are a number of examples, but this is placement by the Biden administration, whoever is running this superstructure of continuity of government people, and they're in that line of succession. That's how it comes down, and it's interesting. When I was looking at the list, as that position comes up as number 11, there are people who aren't qualified because they weren't born in America. So if you're born in Canada or if you're born in Cuba, like Mayorkas, he's another one who can't take position. And it would be like them saying, well, you're in the presidential line of succession. We don't care if the Constitution says you can't be born in America. It's very, very unusual. Now, this is the letter, and I'll just read a little piece of it because I think it gets right to the core, because they know about COG there in the Senate, but they're also very concerned about how this person just bogus nomination into the presidential succession list. These are the Republican senators from the committee writing directly to President Biden. We write today to express grave concerns with your administration's apparent belief that Acting Secretary of Labor Julie Su is eligible to assume the office of President of the United States pursuant to the presidential line of succession, as established by Congress in the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. As you're well aware, since March 14th, 2023, the United States Senate has declined to confirm Ms. Su's nomination as Secretary of Labor, and she continues to lack adequate support from both Republicans and Democrats to be confirmed. Despite that reality, and Ms. Su becoming the longest ever cabinet nominee to await confirmation in a time when the same party controls the White House and the Senate, the White House has chosen to keep her in place as Acting Secretary of Labor on an indefinite basis and has also listed her on the White House website as a member of the cabinet, quote, in order of succession to the presidency. You have to, there's more, of course, but I'm going to, I'll leave that there for now. But you have to understand that continuity of government, like anything else, has a structure. And the only way you get at the structure is seeing things that go outside of the normal channels. So, I've pointed this out with Northcom. Northcom only exists as a result of 9/11. We never even had it. So the idea that somebody from Northcom could take over the United States is pretty unusual. But what's even stranger is a document that I found last year before they confirmed the current Northcom COG commander. And they said, if you don't put somebody in, if you keep holding this up, because they held him up for 2 years, they said, if you don't put him in, we're going to put in the Canadian commander. So that would have made a Canadian in charge of Northcom, which could have taken over the United States. How does that make any sense? Where's the Constitution say that someone from another country can do it? Now, the Canadian people are great. This is the nature of the government tampering here. And that's how you get and you penetrate into how the continuity of government program works. So I went into some detail there. I'm going to give you some broad strokes, and then I'm going to tie it directly into the UFO file as we close here on the special report and then take your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is COG UFO SSP Deep Event Special Report on the heels of the incredible disaster in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee that the media has been ignoring, and I think really illustrates the nature of the election that we're in and how it's very important that the Trump-Kennedy alliance gets in instead of the Harris-Waltz-Cheney alliance, which I think is just a sick, deranged thing, and we're seeing their sickness act out in real time here. We're going to be taking your questions here in about 10 minutes. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Humanarum again. Question, DJ, did you hear at the COG news out of Ohio, quote, after bomb threats, Springfield mayor gives himself emergency powers?
Oh, yes. Yeah. You will see this from time to time. And I also believe that they do a lot of data mining for test runs of the things that they can do under emergency powers. And, but I thought that was a particularly strange one. I noted the fact that they're trying to put the continuity of government into the Constitution as an amendment. Now, let me tell you something. Continuity of government got ratified through the National Defense and National Security Act because they needed a structure to survive a nuclear engagement. That's where it comes from. It doesn't have any constitutional bearing the way that it operates now. For example, zero oversight and all this kind of stuff, and flouting, the rule of law and all the rest of it, and operating in this completely clandestine fashion. Now, the people who are, let's say, around that and pushing for the idea of a COG rule want it to be part of the Constitution before they enact it because they're worried about that. That's probably part of the data that they've been getting when they've looked over this possibility. Now, I don't think that the whole structure is in favor of pushing that COG button, but that element inside of it that has been moving in very unusual ways, shall we say. One of the things that they did is they try to introduce this Continuity Act as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. This only happened 2 weeks ago. And it's very interesting because the characters involved have direct links to the UFO file. I'm going to get into those now.
I want to hear that.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Let's start with this. Derek Kilmer, the Democrat congressman from Washington State, introduces constitutional amendment to ensure congressional continuity, reduce incentive for political violence. It has nothing to do with political violence. Part of the, I can read the whole thing. I printed it out here tonight. It's very quick. It's only 2 pages. But part of the constitutional amendment, what's in there, is the idea that the congressman can say, I want this person to succeed me. Nobody who's elected. Now, we do see unusual things, if a senator dies in a plane crash, sometimes his wife takes over the seat temporarily. There's an election and all the rest. But this is saying, well, I'll tell you what, you just choose somebody. So if you're out, we just have whoever you left in place. This is also part of the continuity of government moves to set up Congress now. Now they're thwarting the will of the voters. But the person that he sponsored the bill with was very interesting. His name was Representative Wenstrup, who is from Ohio. And why was he on the radar recently? Well, Wenstrup warns all about that UFO threat. He's big out there. UFO sightings are national security concern. We need to pursue this. That's Wenstrup. He's the partner of our friend Derek Kilmer, who sponsored the constitutional amendment to ensure congressional continuity. That's the constitutional amendment number 28. And his partner in it was Wenstrup, who has been pushing this UFO threat over the past 2 years. Now, I've said keep an eye on the people who suddenly developed an interest in UFOs out of nowhere in the Senate and the Congress and how they were going to be used later. One of those people is Ruben Gallego, who is fighting off a battle for the Senate with Kari Lake, and they have him actually currently winning in the polls. And I've told the Lake people online and stuff, use the weirdness of his time over here at Harvard studying psychological operations and crowd control. Maybe that'll help you. And the fact that he has all this, we need to find out the truth about those UFOs. This crossover between the COG people and the congressional people, and then the UFO file is absolutely fascinating and feeds right directly into this idea that they want to use the UFO threat to cause emergency powers to come in. That is a kind of the ultimate use of the continuity of government program. Think about it. And it's the ultimate threat, is it not? So it's a heck of a lot easier to manage than, say, a nuclear threat. A lot less damage, too. So there's a lot more to go into in terms of that constitutional amendment. What I want to tell you about it is this. First, it should be rejected completely. So if you have or in the process of being in touch with your congressman, make sure they signal out this continuity amendment and vote no, because the congressional continuity constitutional amendment that will supposedly be used to temporarily fill House vacancies means that they want to be able to replace the entire Congress at the drop of a hat with whoever the person is appointed to. So they want to be able to say to them, you got elected here, you got placed in here, you're accountable here to the voters. And in the case of an emergency, you can snap your fingers and say, I relinquish the whole thing and I send it off to this person, some Yahoo that we don't know anything about. And that person can be just some flunky in the COG arrangement. This is important because COG has done a lot of sneaky things behind the scenes. When they get that public, you got to watch out. And this is the nature of what they do. There's a lot of headlines on this, and I think we have to track the story deep. And the more I track into the story, the more UFO people I find, or sudden converts to this UFO defense thing. Oh, geez, there's a UFO threat out there. We got to stop those UFOs. Suggested 28th Amendment focuses on a terror attack. Lawmakers say it must be easier to quickly fill 100 or more House vacancies with replacements. Now, this is interesting. You really think about what COG would need to do. They don't have the constitutional authority to do what they want to do. They have a kind of a martial law thing they can kick in. They're trying to move through the congressional process. This story is all over the place about the amendment that Wenstrup and his buddy are putting together, and this thing needs to be stopped flat. The 28th Amendment, no amendment to the Constitution at all, and look deep into the backgrounds of the crisscross, and we'll get a better idea, the continuity of government people lining up with the UFO threat people. And I guarantee you, when all is said and done, you're going to find Elizondo, Mellon, that whole gang right in the middle of the whole thing. And, for those people who, first, when I pointed out that the CIA was largely in charge of the UFO threat operation and the whole false UAP disclosure operation, I think a lot of them felt like, well, if that were true, the UFO, researchers would have said it, right? And no, it's wrong, because the UFO researchers, just fell over and didn't do anything and didn't call them out. This is the nature of the problem with that field. It's loaded with a lot of opportunists. But what's interesting is this. The next thing that came up was, oh, well, the CIA has changed now. They're better. This is an interesting story. Assange, when he came out recently, was just talking about how the CIA tried to assassinate him. Okay. Assange is a private citizen. And he was releasing things. We had a case to extradite him. But does that give the CIA any ability to eliminate this guy and assassinate him? No, it doesn't. But here's an interesting thing. A story came out, according to Assange, the CIA was going after his son's DNA. This is the nature of the organization that people want to get UFO disclosure from. Quote, my wife and my infant son were also targeted. A CIA asset was permanently assigned to track my wife, and instructions were given to obtain DNA from my 6-month-old son. You know, that's the nature of the sick bureaucracy that has ruled the roost. And so the idea of throwing, UFO disclosure, something that important to humanity, through, the sleazy Elizondo counter intel people, no, the CIA, look, the whole TTSA thing and all that, it's all CIA operation. That's all it is. And originally, what I did was very simple. From TTSA's own site, which they've taken down, I still have a copy of it. All of the different people all had at least decades-long relationships and work histories with the CIA. And Jim Semivan, who I pointed this out before, he was the COO, Chief Operating Officer for the company. He's a 25-year-old. He's the top of the CIA directorate, a 25-year veteran, the top man. So, and he claimed to be a contactee to boot. Look, those are all CIA people. That whole thing has nothing to do with the real UFO file. That's the whole joke up front, and they want to be able to create a threat. They want to make money doing it, and they want to control that narrative, especially as they want to bring things out. We've talked about that whole breaking back in. They want to be able to reintroduce that high level of technology they've developed in the background on our dime under their secrecy. So you got to get real about that. And this whole phony thing about whistleblower Lou and all that stuff is nonsense. It's all CIA operation. And in fact, I think the intelligence agencies will respect the public more for calling it out and getting rid of it. And on a few different occasions, they have, they've bagged out on Lou, and they've bagged out on a lot of different CIA ops because their tendency to do it, oh, if it's too much trouble, we'll just move into something else, But they see they have an opportunity. What they're trying to do with Elizondo here is very interesting because he failed on 2 different occasions to bring off the op, as it were. So this new version is to have him come in through a publisher of a book and then have them book all these media engagements. So he's avoiding any scrutiny on the lower level of, researchers or podcasts and things like that. He just comes in on this kind of media orchestrated by the intelligence community. So that's what that is. That has nothing to do with people's interaction with UFOs. And we've shown how the UFO file is real on this program, and those experiences that people have are real. Some of them have been engineered, no question, but the majority of those experiences are literal, and there's a long history of it that goes back, and we'll find intergenerationally, it goes back to your parents, your grandparents. Someone back there has encountered this phenomena. So that's the nature of the real thing. The thing that they're pushing up front is dangerous because, they're adopting the whole UFO thing as a threat. And that's where the emergency powers piece comes in. When you find Ohio congressmen suddenly discovering the UFO file and then calling for continuity of Congress where they can snap their fingers and get rid of, just replace everyone that we've sent there, that's very dangerous. And so those constitutional amendments, Constitutional Amendment 28, sponsored by those 2, and I'll say it again, I'll get their names on this, but As I find them, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
He's a Death Star community says, great dot connecting, DJ. A clear implication that UFO could be used to institute COG, just like the report from Iron Mountain back in the 60s stated.
That's a fantastic point. You know, Iron Mountain book looks a whole lot more real as we flash forward now. And there's very deep information in there. And for me, it took a committee of really, you know, some of the best intellects of the period to put together that report. And it's interesting because at times it's been attributed to John Kenneth Galbraith. And, you know, that's somebody who had the wide ranging enough intellect to be able to pull in all those different things and to size up society based on labor, race, war, you know, and all the rest of it. So you needed some very deep thinkers to pull that off. We have a couple of advantages that came out of that period. Another one's the Torbett document. And the Torbett document gives you the Defense Industrial Security Command. That's where the heart of the UFO file was, and the people involved. The level of information in the Torbett document is just stunning. But what it gives you is, for example, the connection of somebody like Roy Cohn to aerospace, the Vatican, and the mafia. You know, those things, if you really want to talk deep state, that's where you're going. And so when you get into somebody like Cohn, but then you bring that around and you realize Cohn is Trump's political mentor and helps him put up things like Trump Tower and lets him know where the bodies are buried in the deep state, then we understand the level of resistance to President Trump, including 2 assassination attempts. Think about that. Absolutely incredible. But for the record, it's Derek Kilmer. It's his proposed amendment to the Constitution. And Brad Wenstrup with the big UFO connection there. William Timmons and Emmanuel Cleaver are also involved. And Timmons has an interesting background. I wanted to say this about Kilmer is he was on the Space Committee in the Senate. So we, you know, space and UFOs immediately with these COG amendment. But we're going to be watching that. So if you didn't catch everything that I was putting across there, don't worry about it. I sent several special reports on our friend Kilmer and his very unusual constitutional amendment, the 28th Amendment. One quick follow-up on all that, and it has to do with our friend
While you're looking that
Kilmer. Yes.
Ultra Heat Seeker says, didn't Werner von Braun's assistant say that he mentioned asteroids and then aliens as manufactured threats to continue funding NASA, but now would fall to the private sector?
Well, I'm glad you brought up NASA there. Look, we know von Braun, this is a very interesting piece there, and we've understood it's a weird thing that it's out there, but it's basically a series of predictions that he gave to his assistant, Carol Rosen. And she was, you know, she came out and she worked with him, the aerospace company that he was in before he died. And he said there's a lot of very interesting stories between them, including the fact that when he was ill, he made her give a speech. And she said, I can't do a speech for you. I don't even know how to do this. He said, don't worry about it. Just go up there. I will be there with you. So she stands up at the podium there and she doesn't know what she's going to say. And suddenly he shows up in her ear. 1976. Think about that. How does that work? If you want to know, does Kamala Harris have wireless earrings that can receive messages and all that? Yeah, they've been doing this for a long time. That's nothing. But he was able to put it across that they were going to use a series of different threats, and that their final 2 threats would be asteroids and finally an ET invasion. And he said, quote, it would all be false. So these are different things that they have set up. Just like, you know, we heard that they had a plan before 9/11 to take over a half dozen countries in the Middle East. So they already had the plans there. They just grab them off the shelf the minute they get the emergency that they need. The deep event, and I'm going to read a quote of the deep event. A couple of last bits here about Derek Kilmer. Here's a shot of our friend Derek. Look at this guy. Derek is out there in Washington State shilling for COG. And quote, he says, I introduced a constitutional amendment to require newly elected representatives to provide a list of at least 5 designees qualified to serve in their place should they pass away during their term. Under our proposal, if a representative passes away, the governor must select a replacement from the list within 10 days, and the Speaker of the House is to immediately fill the vacancy with the chosen individual. The designee would serve as a representative only temporarily. Yeah, so this is introducing continuity of government into the constitutional process of replacing a congressman. This is interesting too. What do you got?
Scarlet Fire says, sorry, where's his pencil pocket protector?
It is, yeah, this is a character.
He's a dangerous nerd.
But yeah, they'll use them. They will use them. There's no question about it. There was a weird thing that came up in the midst of all this, and it'll be my last piece on COG before we do the quotes and then take your questions. But it was this one, and this is quite fascinating. It is the former leader of COG, Northcom Commander Van Herk of the 509th Bombing Group, which after all was the original group that found the Roswell wreckage. Well, he found it years later. And he wasn't around for Roswell, but he came out of the same bombing group. That's quite a fingerprint. Former NORAD chief questions Canada's urgency on Arctic defense. Trudeau has promised to buy fighter jets and subs, but there's not a history of Canada taking those actions, says retired U.S. General Van Herk. Fractures in that deep system. Somebody feels like they're being subverted. Hey, we know how to run this operation. What are you doing? You're using Canadian emergency powers to go around us? So I found that interesting. It's rare to see the deep operators going after each other or questioning each other. That's new. Let's see if more of that comes up as we go. But in isolation, it was pretty interesting. The other thing about Van Herk, of course, is he was the guy who was there during the whole Chinese balloon thing, saying we're shooting down UFOs. They use the phrase repeatedly. And as the NORAD commander, it's to place in the public's idea that we can have something in our airspace as a UFO and then attack it, and NORAD is at the helm. They didn't send Stepford Biden out there to do this and say we're shooting down the Chinese balloon. They sent Van Herk solo. That's his role. He's the COG NORAD commander. So that represented a change. Go back and look in history and look for anything like that Northcom guy coming out and just taking over like that. This is a trial balloon, literally, going on there. This is the joint resolution, and it is the 28th Amendment, proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the U.S. to temporarily fill vacancies in the House of Representatives for the continuity of government of Congress. Now, it's a quick read, and I highly recommend that you do it. But basically, underneath all the flowery language on top and just saying, hey, we might as well have people to do this. Look, we've had the United States Congress for over 200 years. The idea that suddenly they just figured out, we need a process here for how we designate who replaces who. That's pure COG subverting and taking over and saying, here's how you replace the entire House of Congress. That's extremely dangerous. And that the people involved have that UFO connection, to me, says a whole lot based on the kind of research we have here. Now, let's get a couple of things and connect up that deep state UFO world, and then we'll take your questions. How does that sound? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the special report, COG UFO SSP Deep Events. I want to mention to you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and gets us around the incredible secrecy that we experience on a regular basis in dark journalist world. What it lets you know is the incredible interviews, X-series episodes that will blow your mind, documentaries. We have the best documentaries coming up, a docuseries on Kennedy and Lloyd Berkner and the activities of Lloyd Berkner with John F. Kennedy behind the scenes, and also the continuation of our HOTZONE Atlantis documentary series. Stand Up and Be Counted, letting you know the incredible things we have coming up, including interviews, documentaries, and events coming up. All for you and all there. And of course, incredible guests like Dr. Farrell, Gigi Young. When she gets through all this, we'll have Gigi back on the show to tell us. And I want to mention this again, which is remember to get behind the work of Gigi, especially going through all this stuff. I can say this, Gigi, as a friend, she's not a self-promoter at all. So, you know, if you appreciate the work that she does, and as she's going through all this, get there to gigiyoung.com. And I think that she has some shows coming up. So make sure you stand up and be counted and make sure you're there. Okay, let's do this. Wonderful book by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, who I've had some communication with, just incredible people. And they did a wonderful set of books that helped us understand the Aztec case and how real it was, which was a crash in Aztec, New Mexico in 1948, year after the Roswell incident, and an incredible case. They talk all about the work of Bill Steinman, who did UFO Crash. That book is very interesting, is right here. And UFO Crash, it has all the information about Robert Sarbarker, which I consider crucial to understanding anything about UFOs. Sarbarker was best friends with and lifelong colleagues with Thomas Townsend Brown. They were the ones who went away to the western tip of Cuba every year for a month. And we know that's where the secret city off the coast there, which has the Atlantean ruins, right in the heart of the hot zone. So those stories connect up the UFO file and the hot zone quite nicely. But here's what they have to say about Steinman and his discovery of Sarbarker. Sarbarker, I want to say this, he was one of the top physicists. He was like the Oppenheimer, and they had him on the cover of Time, Saturday Evening Post, all the stuff that they did. And this guy was taken out of the history books, doesn't even have a Wikipedia page because he talked to UFOs out of school and died shortly after. Definitely an ex-share personnel. One of Steinman's most important contributions was locating U.S. scientist William Sarbarker to affirm the now famous revelations made by Canadian scientist Wilbert Smith. Smith, who was senior radio engineer for the Canadian Department of Transport to Ottawa, on November 21st, 1950, sent a confidential internal memo to his supervisor titled Geomagnetics. It was never intended to become public information. The document was uncovered by RCAF member and Canadian flying saucer researcher Arthur Bray. Steinman records that the document was originally top secret, but was downgraded to confidential with the stipulation it should never be released to the public. There's a good reason for that. Points made in the document were specific. Get ready. Here's the crossover. The matter of UFOs is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. We know that was the name in the day. It's still better than UAP. Their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. That's the entire MJ-12 arc. Vannevar Bush, his protege was John Trump, Uncle John Trump. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. That's all you need to know. Sarbarker in the 80s was rediscovered by Steinman, who looked him up and said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "Well, look, we we did. We we had crashed UFOs. Yeah, we checked them out. We tried to redevelop the stuff. We went through all kinds of bizarre analysis. I don't know why they never let it out. He said, "Yeah, we found bodies in there too, and the bodies, they were like insects." And he said, "We figured they were designed or built by somebody to pick up the tremendous G-force and things that happen. And what else can we tell you?" He said, he gave him the lineage of who controlled the UFO file, Vannevar Bush, uh, and he went right down the line about the succession list. So he gave out a lot of information. And then he said, "I was in on some of the meetings, but look, Oppenheimer, you know, he was right in the heart of it. Yeah, you bet that he was. Von Braun, yeah, von Braun was working on the UFO redevelopment as well. So you don't need MJ12 documents. You don't need secret this or that. Sarah Barker went on the record with it himself twice over a 30-year period. And the second time around probably cost him his life. As a matter of fact, there was a UFO researcher, Wendell Stevens, who thought that it had cost him his life because it's a weird end to his story. And he lived here in Cambridge and in Florida. But, after he has this series of letters, conversations with Steinman and Stanton Friedman, he goes to his car one day and he gets his hand on the car handle and it's all jelly. And he says, "Oh, it's weird, So his son hears from him and he's calling him from the hospital. He said, "Yeah, I developed these chest pains." He said, "It's really weird too. All I can tell you is there was all this jelly on my door handle." And after that, I was driving and I started to feel sick. I drove to the hospital. So he died shortly after that. So they didn't want, his loose lips around. That's pure X-Protect operation. But Sarah Barker was such an inside man along with T.T. Brown. They were operating on the deepest level. And at the same time, they were under the influence of X-Protect, but they were X-Share people. And X-Protect had a hard time getting rid of them and keeping them under control. And also, there were times when, as T.T. Brown's daughter told me, as soon as he found out what they were doing with his deep research around UFOs, he would bail out and they would go after him. And then he would take the whole family to Eleuthera Island. And she'd say, I'd be a 12-year-old kid and we're surrounded by machine guns, security, to make sure that this group doesn't get their hands on my dad. So there are many stories to tell in the heart of all that. But what I think is important here is that we get it clear that Sarah Barker put on the record the level of secrecy of the UFO file. It's the top secret in the U.S. government. So therefore, all the counter intel, tap dancing, and all the ops and, this level of secrecy, the discrediting of people, and even sometimes the lethal discrediting of people like Morris Jessup. This is very important for us to understand on that level. Now, let's connect it with the next definition, which is the definition of deep events coming directly from Professor Peter Dale Scott of Berkeley University, who's the premier deep state researcher, coined the term, in fact, and in my opinion, the premier JFK assassination researcher. It's a central proposition to this book that the road to U.S. hegemony must be understood as in part a consequence of a series of structural deep events. And this series began with the assassination in 1963 of a president who was moving to change U.S. policies with respect to Cuba, Vietnam, and above all, Soviet Union. By structural deep events, I mean events that are never fully understood and arise out of an ongoing covert processes, have political consequences that enlarge covert government, and are subsequently covered up by demonstrable omissions and falsifications in historical records. Here, the assassination in Dallas may be compared to later structural deep events, most notably Watergate and 9/11. I cannot say enough I am not attributing all these deep events to any single agency or secret team, nor is the purpose of this book to identify the president's killers. But in chapter 2, I will show how alleged evidence about Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico was manipulated and altered by elements in the CIA. Now, deep events. We may be heading into a deep event. So, a deep event, again, is something that the deep state operates, and they will want they will step into the public arena for the deep state event and then retreat again, leaving all the debris. But they've caused a policy change. In 9/11, we got the Patriot Act. In the JFK assassination, you got the Vietnam War. And the UFO file, instead of being shared with the Soviet Union and a joint space program and all the things that Kennedy had outlined that we've revealed in our research, and in a very important special we're doing on the 61st anniversary on November 22nd, right here on this channel. The fact that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file can be understood in the context of that knowledge of what deep events are and the other knowledge of Sar Barker saying the UFO file was the top secret inside the government. When you put those two pieces together, and I'm glad the person earlier mentioned NASA, because NASA is kind of the intermediary between the deep state and the UFO file. They are a recipient of both sides, as much as being just the regular agency that deals with space. They're feeding intelligence back on one hand. And that space intelligence from above, remember, it's very interesting. If you go back and back and back, when we think about this influence of paperclip scientists on NASA and on our government and their kind of martial philosophy invading our government, we have to remember that the original plan in Nazi Germany, before they were defeated, their idea of a rocket program and a space program was simple. It was control things on the ground from above, from space. And, there was the hearkening to Valhalla and, the realm of the gods and Mars and all that. But its essential aspects were, if you want control, you control from above, looking down on everything. They were that advanced to know that this is where things were going. And although their front of the Nazi party got defeated, of course, they reinvested and reemerged in different ways. But they invested themselves in our NASA program. And so that is an aspect and a core aspect involved here. The aerospace aspect in the JFK assassination is the thing that we've brought forward. And, there are a few researchers who get to that point. And one of those people was Jim Garrison, whose final conclusion was pretty simple. He said, this was actually done by the aerospace wing of the military industrial complex. And they did it through the intelligence corridor between the aerospace companies and the intelligence complex. That's crucial because this is the only guy who actually ever pressed a case in JFK's murder. So that's where he got to. Later, there are a lot of obfuscations in all of this. Mafia and all this kind of thing. And of course, the ridiculous story of the lone nut and all the rest of it. But it forms a core of reality problem. And the reality problem is the people on the ground don't believe that official story, which is a foundation, bedrock story of American history. And at the same time, they've been flooded with different versions, so they don't know exactly which version is true. The aerospace one is often left out because that's where you find the core of the piece. A quote now from Garrison, and then we'll move to your questions. This is from that Assassination of America book, and I will say it on the record, the rarest book, the most difficult book to find in all of my travels ever. And I was able to find the entire set. It took a long time. But here's what Garrison had to say while he was in the middle of his case, understanding who he was up against. And remember, Garrison kept running into strange UFO aerospace aspects in his case. And he's like, where's this coming from? Question. Do you have any doubt that Robert Kennedy would have opened the whole case up again once in the White House? Garrison. I don't think there's any question at all. I think the fact that he was killed so quickly indicate that there's no question in the mind of the cabal element of the CIA. I think in his case, they had no other alternative. I'm sure they were reluctant to go through another assassination, but they were not taking the chance of him becoming president. Question. Do your investigations still point to any right-wing elements? This is Garrison. It isn't really right-wing. Technically, it's a fascist structure in that it's diametrically opposed to communism, but in a way that's almost a centrist sort of thing. It is a power which has developed within the government like a thunderhead. The role of the Central Intelligence Agency has become so clear that where you see these organizations used, such as the National States Party, the one they use the most, it's an organization which they've penetrated at an earlier date. The one talent the CIA has developed more than any other intelligence agency on Earth is deception and cover. Since survival is involved down to the last individual, they have cover. This guy's a priest in the old Orthodox Church. This guy is active in the National States Rights Party. It always gives them cover. So you never have anybody in the CIA, but when you actually end up with is the Central Intelligence Agency. Think about that with Thomas Crooks or Robert Ruth, and you find that you're still battling the same force that we're coming to grips with here. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. Walter Bosley Chano. Fake space threat could be, quote, space virus, allegedly brought here by, quote, infected meteorites.
Interesting. I'll tell you why that's interesting. The one of the traits that I couldn't figure out when I was looking at all the TTSA people is they all had some medicine background. And in the case of Elizondo, he had actually patented some tropical diseases. So, yeah, we're going to be talking to Walter soon as well. What do you got?
El Cid Barrett, does DJ think the flap over the Capitol in 52 is our first set of SSP craft showing off? What do you make of that?
Well, the nature of what happened there is some kind of a threat. It's somebody's display. And what's interesting is the whole thing that they've done about the UFO threat is interesting because they've taken what I think are this observable phenomena and turned it into a threat. But there's some aspect deep in the technology, and this is where we get into X-Tech, which you might be dealing at sometimes with an off-world civilization, but not necessarily. And there are other things that could be involved, including an ancient technological aspect. So there's also something that shows up in Farrell's work about extraterritorial groups. So, the continuation of the Bell technology in Argentina. And I think it is quite fascinating. You get a case like Kecksburg in the 60s because it does, it resembles the Bell. There's no question about it. So I think that attributing everything to some alien civilization isn't correct. It seems like there are levels of advancement that go on right here directly. It's very interesting. There's a guy who fell into disfavor later, but they called him Eklel Kushana, and he wrote a book called The Ultimate Frontier. And he had a very interesting series of books called Observations. And he would talk about how the mystery schools operated very advanced craft and how it would, move them um, from place to place in a dramatic fashion after the kind of fashion of the Atlanteans. And his real name is Richard Keeninger, and he wrote Ultimate Frontier. Um, and later on, he fell into kind of cult leader status and had big problems. And but it is interesting.
Is the big problem always like sleeping with your
Oh,
acolytes?
he had all kinds of peccadillos, and but nonetheless, there's a few things he put out that I think carry some muster, carry some weight. Oddly enough, uh, he had that to say about it. And what was interesting is I went back to finding a series of letters between Helena Blavatsky and her sister. Those are very, very interesting letters. Some of the most interesting letters I think you could read. And in one of those letters, it's very clearly spelled out that the mystery schools run every major mine in the world: diamond mines, gold mines, silver, and everything else. And that, it was brought up, the exploitation that happens and how they had problems trying to reveal mines or work with the public on this, and that how it always turned into, power, control, gun battles, whatever it happened to be. But this idea that the mystery schools ran gold mines and ran the majority of the mines on Earth really makes you wonder about the structure of things on Earth. And when you think about advanced technology and you think about the level of advancement that earlier cultures, like the Atlantean culture, had in the work of Steiner and Edgar Cayce, and really getting deep into it. Edgar Cayce's work is some of the most important deep work on Atlantean technology. And I think his own organization is afraid of it because, Cayce doesn't talk about, they were able to get flight and, just have some primitive flying around. And he's like, no, they could fly underwater, they could fly in the sky. And, there's some questions where they ask him, well, was the altitude high? Did they fly above mountains and things like that? And he'd say, well, they'd fly through mountains. Dematerialization. Figure that one out. And then, of course, I think one of the most important quotes that he gave was, well, they said, well, can you give some indication of what the crafts were like? And he said, well, there's a description of them given by Ezekiel, but this was a much later date that he's giving it, which means the Atlantean vehicles, which were advanced in 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 BC, somebody was still operating them by the time you get around to Ezekiel. You're talking around 1,000 BC in the regular dating. So somebody has it, because that's what Ezekiel is seeing, according to Cayce. That, that deserves a look, in my opinion. Yes, what do you got?
Scarlet Fire says, I read it was the Nazis showing off over DC in 52.
Yeah, well, there's that whole, post-war fascist international, Nazi international, that Farrell talks about. And that's an aspect of this advanced technology. There's no question some branch of that technology, if you just look at the scientists and the groups involved with the Bell, and the horrible thing about the scientists that they had working with the Bell was that they killed a number of them in order to prevent the Russians or the Americans getting their hands on that. And so when we look at that, you have to go into a deep level of where that stuff went after the war. There's that amazing story that John Warner told me publicly here on this channel. One of the best interviews we did, and we'll have John back on too. But John said that, Paul Mellon, his grandfather, who was deep, deep in this. Remember, the son of Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, and sort of deep man in the deep state. Well, he went over to Nazi Germany right after the war, and he was inspecting a lot of the aircraft that they had. And he stood on top of a saucer that was as big as a football field and a half. So it was 150 yards, right? That's pretty big. So that's what the Nazis had. And this is by his direct observation. And he told it to him in private, not expecting, he's going to go out and talk about this. So these are the types of things that we understand. We know that these groups had advanced technology that they didn't show at all, and that they would keep a certain thing out there to the world and they'd hold back the other part. There are advanced groups when it comes to technology. There's advanced groups, of course, when it comes to mystery knowledge as well. And I think what's important along the way is to just keep that in mind as we go. Things make a lot more sense. It doesn't mean that we should fantasize, oh, there's all this stuff out there. There's good hardcore points to connect on what it is that we're talking about. So as long as we know, for example, that Tsar Barker was working on advanced craft that were considered higher than the atomic bomb based on his own testimony, then you don't need to have a fantasy about what it is, because he's already given you something on the record. Yes.
Pono 8888. Remember Alex Jones at the North Carolina underground entrances interviewing truck drivers saying they drive thousands of miles underground?
Oh, yeah. What is the name of that mountain chain out there? The Ozarks. And see, but I've heard this from other people too, that people who are involved in underground bases, that when you go down, it's really far down. This is not, it's you're going substantially down. But the weird thing is, the descriptions are, when you get down there, you have a gigantic metropolis of a city, and you have, apartments, living arrangements, and all the rest of it. So we don't know enough about how that underwater or underground world works. And God forbid the underwater world. Yes.
Ray Story, do you think the Gaston County, North Carolina lithium mining approval was a reason to steer a hurricane there? There are a lot of questions surrounding that.
I think that was an interesting discovery. I don't know, when it comes to weather modification, we started the program off with the fact that it exists. It can be used. Governments have used it. We've seen some very glaring episodes of the government using it for land grabs and things of that nature. I don't know what they were doing in relation to this storm. Its sudden ferocious appearance, I think, is very suspect. But whether devised, for a purpose, or just a storm hitting the way that it did, their response shows the contempt.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah, and it's a dehumanization of the people who are there. That's the greatest tragedy of it, and it very well could have been a weather modification incident. I think that we know people who've put this on the record and really spent a life developing it. Nick Bagich, who's been on this program, gave us the whole piece about HAARP. Remember, he was writing about HAARP in the 1990s. Well, he's much deeper than just the HAARP subject, but from there, people like Alana Freeland really giving us that. One of the greatest things that Alana ever told me, and I always love her work, is she said, well, one of their goals, what they've been able to do is make people walking towers. You're a walking tower in their grid. That's important. We need to understand the level that they're on. I do this with the COG commanders. The COG commanders, they're in there like Dr. Strangelove. They think they're going to repopulate the planet after destruction. They talk about nuclear exchanges and things. Look, here's what we get from the mystery material. There are earth changes coming. There are pole shifts involved with that earth change.
Nobody wants to hear this.
Well, let me tell you, They understand it.
Mhm.
They're watching and they're doing their own measuring of how this goes down so that when it goes down, they end up on top. So, they have their own kind of psychics working on this problem. So the faster that we catch up to what the mystery schools have left out there in public, the better off we'll all be. Bringing that up, look, the mystery schools said it plain. What did Casey say? It was land rising. It's off the East Coast, round Bimini. Well, you always hear about coast rising and things going underground, underwater. It's a threat. Even though Obama buys Martha's Vineyard houses for $50 million. It's hard to buy, isn't it? Well, Casey has it around a little bit. As things go down, other things are coming up. And that's where you get the whole piece around the hot zone that we've put forward. Hemingway's brother buying lots, John Lennon buying lots in the Atlantic Ocean, thinking this is where it's going to rise. And when it rises, it's going to be international territory. No government owns it. I'll claim it as a nation. Hemingway did. He called his nation New Atlantis. They know something. There's something that's been going on in certain circles for a long time about the rising of land masses. You don't hear about that one. That's a key one. That's where the alternative media can bring new things forward that are better than, hey, there's stasis giants in Antarctica. This is a little bit, this comes directly out of a mystery tradition. Might be able to do something with that one. Yes.
JJ Rodriguez, could the ones who control the weather be in on the smart cities building and real estate business? I believe that they're creating this weather in places they want to make into smart cities.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that they plan to get rid of a number of cities. Also having a city so desperate, like they could make San Francisco or New York City so desperate that they'll take anything. They'll be like, just come in and take over. It's like, oh, I'm a tech giant. I'm going to come in and build you a smart city. Don't worry about it, And, but they are getting ahead of themselves also. And also a lot of what they've been doing with the whole electric car thing, saying, well, this is going to improve the environment. They're destroying the environment to build them. So none of the things that they're saying on the surface make sense. Therefore, the leadership structure can't be trusted for the truth. But I
Well,
think
they can't be trusted with the job because
Yeah.
it's anti-human. It's very Ahrimanic.
Yes, absolutely. And it's quite fascinating to me because when I think about what they're up to, I think to myself, they know everything from the mystery level about Earth changes, and that a number of the things that they're doing that we don't understand are because they're preparing for Earth changes. You know, what did Casey say about the upper portion of Europe will be changed in the twinkling of an eye? Well, that's pretty fast. Uh, California is supposed to go underwater. New York is supposed to be destroyed. Um, and these are, is it this generation? Is it the next generation? Something in there from all this that got missed, and you had all these groups, these people labor to bring the stuff out. I think about this sometimes, and it's quite interesting to me. I've been reading Rudolf Steiner since I was a teenager, right? And at a certain point, I realized, well, this guy spent 4 decades of his life. He went in spiritually, he went in intellectually, he did the whole bit to try to tell people to prepare them for the advent of Ahriman in the 21st century and the eighth sphere, and how this virtual realm that was being developed was a trap. And it had just occurred to me one day after spending all this time, all these years reading his stuff, it was just a flash of realization like, oh, it's the level on which it's received also. The information's clearly there. The information has already been out there. Very often, I think we hunt for the right kinds of information, but a lot of it is already there. And it's how you put it together, it's how you assimilate it. Very often, you find people who can get into alternative subjects and then they find themselves, just running down a bullet list of different things. And you realize, oh, it's never going to stick to your bones because you're not assimilating any of it. You're just getting this kind of, I don't know what you would call that, but it's like an adrenaline hit for each new high point. But actually, it's assimilating the knowledge of the thing and making it part of your realization. That kind of becomes a part of you. And so I had that about Steiner and Ahriman. Yes, Miss Olivia. Wait,
Interesting.
before you go any further, this is the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to take a couple more of your questions. This is the special report, COG, UFO, and the Secret Space Program. Deep event. These things are all linked. Those acronyms are so important in the middle here as we have about 32 days left until this election. I mean, and this is the most crucial election of your life. By the way, President Trump is going back to Butler, and Elon Musk is going to be at that event, which I think is extraordinary. The alliance that's going on the Trump side with Tulsi Gabbard and Kennedy, Musk, all of that, I think is an incredibly positive development. Even though I think that Musk has been put out there in a lot of different ways, and based on the nature of his connections and the SpaceX part, I hardly think of him as just some
A one-dimensional hero.
beneficent, no, there's a lot going on there. I mean, again, when you're the richest man in the world, supposedly, there's a group running the things that you do. But nonetheless, there's a group aligning with Trump, and the Trump group, I think, is very important. And the Kennedy presence, you have to understand when you're looking at UFO and COG and the SSP, it's all there. And in Kennedy's family's background, literally, it's the deep state group that removed his uncle and his father, and from those levels of power, about to be president and president for 3 years. And the same group got involved with trying to assassinate Trump. So there's an arc there, and we have to complete the arc. This is the facing off against the other thing. And the other thing is very hard to name because of the way that the media has covered up a lot of these individuals. But I think what you're seeing, and it's very clear, the North Carolina thing, the tragedy that comes through it is that the Democrats have become so sick. The group running them is so ill that the only thing they can think of is some way to benefit from this. And I think it's a crucial turn in the entire election process. And I also feel that COG is active in this election. So I'm hoping that we can get through and vote an election instead of having COG step in. So, but I'm keeping an eye on all aspects. And I'll tell you this, that the 28th Amendment that we got so deep into tonight, brought forward by those senators who were involved in the Space Committee and the UFO file, that's a major step by that group. And they can't be allowed, they have to be pushed back legislatively from getting that amendment. It's no question. Yes.
David Donaway, will the hurricanes impact regions that could impact the U.S. elections? Of course, hurricane fallouts will have political impacts. It does seem from various sources the federal government is impeding citizen efforts to help those hit by hurricanes directly. So we're coming up against a deadline for voter registration. A lot of people have lost everything, including their voter IDs, which now they need in North Carolina. The areas that were hit hardest were Republican strongholds.
Well, I told you that Axelrod came out and he was bragging about the fact that he thought his ritzy Democrat friends in Asheville would be able to do this, but that the Trump voters wouldn't be able to come out. It's a sick thing to even think about. I think it's going to take a couple of weeks for us to realize the nature of the conditions that are going on there. All the rescue that's going on there is the important part. But in a couple of weeks, the whole infrastructure and how it's set up would help you understand how it would run an election. It's very hard to say. I will tell you this, that I believe it's 16 electoral votes that North Carolina has are crucial in this election. And North Carolina, Trump bested the Democrats in North Carolina, and he was about to in this election as well. So I don't know how things are going to turn out in terms of North Carolina. Obviously, the important thing is, first of all, that this insane administration get the aid to the people there. It's, and this is amazing that the media thinks that they can get around this. I started the program off with, they had some stupid actor. They were like, hey, he wore blackface in 2006. Look, when people are dying, no one cares if some idiot was insensitive 20 years ago, and the illness is so deep. Like the problem is that the illness is so deep in the structure that the entire structure may need to melt down, because the media is sick, and the leadership structure is sick, the establishment is sick, the think tanks are sick. I mean, it's almost too much illness. It becomes top heavy from illness, and what is the thing that's top heavy, it collapses. So I think that the chance of the Kennedy-Trump alliance is the thing that will turn it around. There's going to be difficulties no matter what. But for me, that's the big turnaround, which is why the black pill thing, is harmful. And, a lot of I want to say this, that there was an event called Rescue the Republic, and it featured people like RFK and Tulsi and stuff. And they are aware that there's a big problem. Now, not everyone who was on the list of speakers or whatever is somebody you're going to agree with or whatever. It doesn't matter. These are people who are aware that something fundamentally going on in there. And the black pill group went against them and tried to say, oh, you're Zionist or something. It sounds pretty lame after a while. So the Webb stuff, Whitney Webb, who I like and I've had on this program, and now I'm forgetting the guy's name, Bros, I think it is.
Derek Bros.
Yeah. So, and he's, come into my threads and been like, oh, this, the RFK thing is just a rehash and all this stuff. Look, that's fine. Any opinion that you have for your own voting is fine. But you can't the idea of going after people who are trying to rescue the Republic, what is that? Why would you go after that? Why don't you go after Kamala Harris? Go after Waltz. Go after the illness of the Cheney COG thing. You can do some good there. So, and in the case of some of these people, if you're living abroad, and you're living in some European country, and I love Europe, but if you've tucked yourself away, or if you're in, South America or something, the things that are happening here, if you care about America, then you should be here and working with people to help them deal with the changes that are going on. And the idea of like throwing darts and making the perfect the enemy of the good is wrong. Especially in this election, it could be very harmful, and it might be a kind of a cool pose or whatever, but it doesn't do anything. And ultimately, you're going to need to change the administration, especially if you have Cheney linked with Harris now. It's more important than ever to get those people out of there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report, COG, UFO, and SSP Deep Event. I'm even saying that anyone who, even people that I don't think have go very deep or whatever, but anyone who's on that side of getting the Trump-Kennedy alliance in power to give them a shot for cleaning this up, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. And, if I mentioned earlier that Tucker Carlson didn't go deep on UFOs, like, He'll learn eventually on that, but he's good, very good on the election, understands it perfectly, and I'm right there with him. I'm aligned with all those people who want to see Trump and Kennedy get across the finish line on November 5th, and I think they got a boost from the debate on Tuesday, and I think that Vance was good in the debate. Waltz showed it's like it's the weird, it's the inner
That he's
psycho there.
nuts and
Well,
creepy
there's just a thing there, which is
and a knucklehead.
right. He has a problem with the truth. He wants to shut off your free speech. He wants to be a sanctuary cities for your kids who want to have transgender. Like, it's all a sick wash, And if anything, maybe we can flush all of that out of the country. That would be an incredible benefit for them. They took the mask off, and everyone can see just how corrupt the whole thing is. And but I got to tell you, I'm 100% wanting Trump and Vance, Kennedy, that alliance to go through instead of Cheney, Harris, Waltz. That'll be a disaster. I think there's a danger of them trying to lure Trump into a battle with Iran because they set up this whole thing about Iran trying to assassinate Trump. And then it's come out now, it's official, that the FBI was working with those Iranians the same way they worked with the people who were supposedly going to kidnap Gretchen Fonzie Whitmer, who always likes the leather coat. And one of the weird things, if you get into the court cases around the Whitmer thing, and they let those guys, most of them go, I think, because the whole thing was orchestrated by the FBI. But the FBI had agents sleeping with the designated culprits on this to influence them. I mean, this is quite an op. When you look at that and then you transfer it over to this Iran situation and them trying to inflame Trump saying, "Oh, Iran is trying to assassinate you. It's not us." He has to have people around him who are telling him, "Look, they're feeding you." That intel briefing isn't worth the paper it's written on. That I think is something that needs to be brought right up. But I can see that Trump believes in a strong border, believes in the Constitution. He comes from classic America. His alliance with Bobby is crucial, and Bobby's presence in this election is almost supernatural.
You don't even have to go. You know what? Just simplify the whole thing. I mean, if it's not the border for you, it's censorship. There's only one party right now. There's only one person to vote for. If you care about this channel, if you care, if you care about us still being here, like,
excellent
that's
point.
it. Vote Trump.
It's true. Look at what's happening in Europe. It's terrifying. And to our listeners in Europe, I want to say, people in the UK, our different listeners, they get it. They understand. And they understand the regimes that are coming in to try to censor their speech. Of course, we had the terrible case in the UK of when, they had people censored online, but they went further and they said, well, if you say anything against these illegal immigrants we have pouring in here, you're going to go to jail for a year, and they had these weird Poindexter cops coming on and saying, and you Americans, you want to do that, we'll extradite you. No, Poindexter, you're not going to do that. What's interesting to me is they're trying to create powers that they don't have. And in England, you don't have that power. In America, you don't have that power. And particularly in America, which is founded on free speech. And where does that come from? That came from the founding fathers understanding that King George was a psychopath, and anyone who spoke against him would end up in jail in a dungeon. You never hear from them again. It's human experience. It's deeply ingrained. You can't have a marketing program to get rid of it. So King George tried, and he got Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington up his butt. So, you can have a huge backlash from this. Yes.
Okay, Scarlet Fire. Ukraine canceled their election to keep the war going against the will of the citizens. Will the USA do the same? And Fuber Fighter, don't you think it's very likely that there's going to be a struggle for power as soon as COG goes into place?
Yeah. COG, I'll tell you, COG can be thwarted in a few ways. You raise awareness about it, people understand this group is going to benefit from emergency powers. They're going to be very leery when an emergency pops up that makes these people martial law dictators. That's one. Two, if you give the mechanisms like a UFO threat, um, and some people could say in some ways we've been like a lone outpost warning about the UFO threat aspect mixed with the CIA presence. But that ripple of understanding of us in the ideas from talking about these things, it's caught in different places. You'd be surprised at the people who watch this program or in that ideas room. So it's very important, I think. One person armed with the truth constitutes a majority. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. The other thing about COG, I think, is it's a tremendous risk on their part. So I thought it was interesting that a few people were saying the way that this government and this administration is treating the people in North Carolina, they don't expect that there's going to be an election come November. That's a very interesting thought for us to pause and think about. These are politically savvy enough people. Why would they be letting themselves be exposed for their contempt of humanity the way that they are? And the incredible, it's not ineptitude. It is, it's a calculating withholding of support from devastated communities. So it's a very sick thing. And I think we're going to have to bring more attention to it and see how it all plays out. But I am saying that, it's interesting to consider it from that point of view. Have they given up so much on the normal state of affairs that they just aren't even bothering to act at this point? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Take two more questions, and then we're going to leave you tonight. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and gets us around this censorship. We have incredible things coming up for you in October, November, and for the rest of the year. Documentaries, special events, and interviews that'll blow your mind, and X-Series episodes off the charts, including a very special November 22nd docuseries kickoff, and also a new upcoming episode in the docuseries of the Hot Zone. So make sure you're on that newsletter and stand up and be counted. Miss Olivia, choose them wisely with two more questions.
Okay. All right, Margaret Hoff, DJ. What do you think of Alex Jones claiming that the deep state will start a civil war if Trump is elected? A lot of people are predicting a black swan event, and if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to project it. I can tell you how I analyze it. I do think that Trump, I've looked at the electoral map very closely, and it's very difficult for the Democrats to beat Trump in a fair election because they've had a terrible economy. They have a terrible record. They've let the border collapse. They're starting all these wars overseas. They don't have a good candidate. And they've had Stepford Biden up there bumbling for 3 years, being run by people with lanyards in the back. So in general, the push is to throw the bum out. That's where the weight of things is. Trump is coming in, and once he got Kennedy's support, remember, Kennedy got as high as 15% of the vote himself. It's a tremendous lift. So in my opinion, under normal circumstances, Trump would win. And then the most dangerous period would be between the inauguration and being the incoming president-elect. And you've got a couple of months there So I think it would constitute a strange situation. And I think they've tried to lay down narratives where they can still keep power, you know. So that's where I think a COG piece is, and the whole thing about civil war. I do believe that they want a chaotic environment so they can call in a COG emergency response.
They have to. I mean, I
Yeah.
just keep going because they've committed such incredible treason and genocide that, I mean, they cannot be held accountable.
Yes.
They cannot
Yes.
afford that. It's, I mean, they're going to throw every option at it so that they will never have to be accountable for their crimes.
Well, it's true. I think also that they don't want to deal with 4 years of Trump. They need some way around it. And we've seen from the assassination attempts, that's been their solution. It hasn't worked. Um, Putting him in jail hasn't worked. Trying the endless media barrage against him hasn't worked. So if they're committed to that, they're running out of options. I have an interesting quote here to close the show with, and we'll take your last question,
Okay.
Miss Olivia, which is from American Deep State. Again, Peter Dale Scott's book, brilliant summation of 5 decades of deep research. Here's his conclusion. Quote, since the 1950s, American history has seen two competing narratives, one relatively stable and benign, and one posing a lawless and dangerous threat to constitutional democracy. On the one hand, a succession of power-hungry men have amassed excessive powers and then in consequences have self-destructed and been ousted. Joe McCarthy in the 50s, Richard Nixon in 74, Oliver North in 86, Donald Rumsfeld in 2006. The rise and fall might suggest that American politics essentially comprises a self-correcting homeostatic system, one in which excessive power generates counterforces to correct it, but the appearance of equilibrium is misleading. Each of these viable figures exercise power because of their connection to the subterranean accumulation of illegal, secret powers assembled originally and principally by J. Edgar Hoover. Remember, Hoover was around since the 1920s. The departure of individuals did not establish effective legal checks and balances in the deep powers behind them. The one serious congressional effort to do this after Nixon's resignation in 1974 was successfully stymied largely by two men, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who went on to plan successfully for the expansion and implementation of these same COG powers. The second narrative illustrates the truth of the principle well understood by America's founding fathers that power unchecked will continue to grow like a cancer. The unchecked growth of the security state has been reinforced by a parallel related development, the unchecked accumulation of gross wealth by the top 1% of the 1%. The combined growth of great wealth in the security state has radically diminished the powers of the public state, and above all, Congress, to restore equilibrium to the American political system. This process, as many have warned, is not at all homeostatic, but threatens disaster if not brought under control, unquote. That's Professor Scott writing 10 years ago. Where are we now? So I think with that, we'll take your last question, Ms. Olivia.
Okay, Harvardian. DJ, what is the October surprise, if not UFO fake threat?
I think it's a very good candidate. I think that the UFO threat in combination with COG, triggering COG, is why we're seeing this UFO threat thing floated again and why you see Elizondo rolled out, etc. So you're right in the heart of that. I don't know if they think that they can pull that off. But something is going on deep in that system. The October surprise could be the elevation of Harris to the presidency, and so they would try to, use the powers of the presidency there. Or it may constitute either a cyber attack or a Russian nuclear exchange. These things are all on the table. For me, the UFO threat is very appealing to them. I'll tell you why. they've worked on it for a long time, and it's something which, is part of their plans. So for me, once they had the Northcom commander talking about shooting down UFOs in 2023, that doomsday clock around the subject that I was talking about moved closer to midnight as far as the activation of COG. So we'll see. But certainly the aerospace aspect, it's too ignored. Aerospace is at the heart of the destruction of the political system. You have to understand the aerospace piece if you want to get to the real core. And with that, Miss Olivia, we will take your super chatters.
Okay, let me get them up.
Nicely done.
Okay.
Wow, fantastic.
So thanks to Ramblin' Lamb, a cult fan, Norman Lee Smith Music, AM, Brian Paget, Alarminine Bay, Terry Doherty, John Meskers, Jay Parson, Mark Lingerfeld, Happy Hermit 3D, Erica Swenson Elliott, Eurythmy is Fun, Joseph Anthony, Amarillo Gunrunners, Kryptonians 13, Stephen Spencer D.O., MDDC, The Bikini Truther, John Thayer Sr., Sandra McDonald, Sarah Jane, Roosevelt Media News, Karen Carpenter, Nancy Mercier, Janie, Short Order Cook 1, The Cove Channel, C.A. Beverforden, David John Moan, St. John Penuel Chidester III, the Ear Implant Foundation, and Roosevelt Media News. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Wow, we really appreciate your support. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We couldn't do it without you. And it makes a huge difference to everything that we do here. We will be back with you next week. And I'm going to do some shout outs here.
Could I just say some prayers, obviously, for Gigi?
Oh, yes.
For Mr. Wolf, for Leighton, and for Alexander Bruce of Forbidden Knowledge TV. Who've all been hit and impacted badly by this Hurricane Helene.
No question. And I recommended to everyone, because of her incredible work directly with me, and Gigi's a great friend to me, but a great friend to the show. And if you like the work that we do here, support the efforts of Gigi Young. She's just such an important force out there. And go to gigiyoung.com, become a member, support the work that she's doing. Or, she has a number of shows coming up on YouTube as well. And so she's in our thoughts. Alexandra, I'm glad you mentioned that. Alexandra from Forbidden Knowledge TV also was dealing with all of this. And, a number of people, I guess I have a number of friends who basically made an exodus from New York to North Carolina, and it seemed like a safety haven from the insanity of New York. And, North Carolina has so many fantastic people and fantastic cities. In Asheville, of course, is one of them, Raleigh, Durham, the whole thing. And I think it's an incredible state with incredible potential. So for the people there, just, hang in there and hopefully help is on the way all around. But what an incredible tragedy for us to witness. And the government, of course, needs to step up, but people apparently are already stepping up. I have heard that President Trump did a GoFundMe fundraiser there. And then there's another one for people who don't like GoFundMe, which is legit. And I will put the link to that up on Twitter, because you can't do things like that here on this show. But quite fascinating, all the responses and the credible efforts by people there to help each other. The stories that I've heard are absolutely mind-boggling, with the kind of, it seems legitimately like they allowed people to suffer far beyond what they would have in an ordinary situation. And the media has covered for them, which I think is a great, the kind of contempt, I think, that the media has for humanity, and that the Democrats have for humanity, as that force controlling the Democrats, not real Democrats. But I think it's on display here, and as is the good-natured quality of the people of North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee. I found a quote that I was going to read from Fletcher Prouty, which I think gives us the kind of rounding out of the whole UFO aspect here, and then we'll close the show up with a few shout outs. This is from his re-release of his book, which is a mind bender called The Secret Team, and it's the 1997 re-release of the book. Here is from his forward and intro. Quote, "The fundamental game of the secret team, they have this power because they control secrecy and secret intelligence because they have the ability to take advantage of the most modern communications weapons system in the world, a global transportation systems, quantity of weapons of all kinds when needed, the full support of a worldwide U.S. military supporting base structure. They can use the finest intelligence system in the world, and most importantly, they've been able to operate under the canopy of an assumed ever-present enemy called communism. It'll be interesting to see what enemy develops in the years ahead. It appears that UFOs and aliens are being primed to fulfill that role for the future. That is the threat, just like they used communism." So I'll read it again. "It will be interesting to see what enemy develops in the years ahead. It appears that UFOs and aliens are being primed to fulfill that role for the future. To top all of this, there is the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency itself has assumed the right to generate and direct secret operations." Prouty was in a position to know. He was the intermediary at the most secret point between the Joint Chiefs and Kennedy's CIA. So for me, him warning us about the UFO threat in 97, here we are 25, 27 years later. And, that it's coming to fruition here. And
They
with
were
that,
asking what book that was from?
it's from the Secret Team 1997 re-release, and it's in the intro. Quite fascinating indeed. So I'll do some shout outs now, but Prouty was a force to be reckoned with. And his boss was Ed Lansdale. Figure that one out. Bikini Truther. Can DJ show it? The quote? Yeah, it's actually, I just tweeted it. That is the quote there. Quite fascinating. You can always screen snap it to read it later. Ryan Perella. It's great to see you, sir. Ann Cassius, Roger Z, Wayne Peak, Don Newway, Fletcher Prouty, indeed. That is who we're talking about. Jonathan McIntosh. Of course, we had Dr. Farrell out there. We're going to have a conversation with Dr. Farrell coming up. Cheney COG and Cheyenne Mountain. Out of Cheyenne Mountain, indeed. T. Oliver. Ivana, Cove Channel, Beth Noyes. She says, "Hang in there, praying for you all." Thank you, Beth. Yes. Mike Adams, Health Ranger, donates food. Yeah, Mike, huh? Orpheus, that character can be Republican. Aliens are so everyday now, maybe dinosaurs. Wally Tango. Oh, that's great. Cove Channel, Scarlet Fire. Hey, one enemy at a time. That's great. Roosevelt Media News. Good to see you out there, sir. Thanks for the visual of King George's big butt. Good show tonight, DJ and Olivia. King George he did all kinds of things to blame on the founding fathers. Those stories are amazing. He would blow up ships and then be like, "Oh, Jefferson did it," This is low psychopath. The Secret Team is a great book. I've read it twice. Really fantastic book. I highly agree. Don Newway, Corey Anderson, Sarah Ann. Prayers and peace for all affected. Absolutely. Joseph Anthony, Ivan Langley, Corey Anderson, the Cove Channel, Najat Madre. It's great to see you. Great connecting tonight, DJ. Thank you. Shelley Penn. Good night, indeed. Nina says, wow, what a great crew. And there were great thoughts going off there in the ideas room, setting off all kinds of sparks everywhere. Um, Bob Marley. It's great to see you out there, Bob. Bang a gong. Get it on. Crypto bits. Barto, Whitehawk. Whew. That's funny. None dare call it conspiracy. That's one of the originals. Really good too. Wow. You know, Alex Jones, when I went on my interview with Alex Jones, we did 4, believe it or not. And we had a great time. And he actually knew a great deal about the UFO file, which, you know, I should have expected, but he surprised me. He knew a lot. And he mentioned None Dare Call It Conspiracy was a book that kind of red pilled him very early on. Mr. Wolf, it's great to see you out there. And good luck navigating everything there. Jen Passavant, much like the Nord Stream pipeline, the Russians did it exactly. The Russians are coming. That's another big one for October to keep the eyeballs glued for that. Wait, DJ and the Good Doctor should do a show together soon. We certainly will. I've got I've got a special thing for Dr. Farrell, and I think this, since it relates to the mayor of Area 51, I think he's going to be very interested in it. And Farrell has a new book coming out on Abraham Lincoln, which I haven't. It's going to be published soon, so I can't wait to take a deep look at that, because I don't know anyone who knows more about the Civil War than he does. Absolutely incredible.
Can I throw something in there?
Yes.
I think this is appropriate. So I keep thinking about MLK, MLK's "Been to the Mountaintop" speech, and
Oh
this
yeah.
particular thing. Well, I just want to quote it. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And that line in particular is that, you know, all of us, we'd like to have a nice, safe life and be able to binge watch whatever, you know, and all of those little comforts. But this is an opportunity. This is something shifted. And, you know, this is our moment to have purpose. And that means taking care of each other.
That's really true.
And we have to sort of rise to the challenge, whatever it is. There are people who have been out for 6 days, going on 7, without sleep, you know, feeding people, you know, rescuing people. This is an amazing moment to be alive and to serve our countrymen, you know, and our country in ways that we would not have chosen, but it's thrust upon us, and we can seize the moment and be the greatest versions of ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. And I think it's a perfect note to end on. And our thoughts and prayers go out to all the people affected in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. We will be back with you next week. And we have some very exciting surprises coming up for you this month. And I can't wait to bring out some of the really incredible things that we have coming up for you. Remember, if you're new, go to that darkjournalist.com website and sign up for the newsletter. It'll keep us in touch. And, you know, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends.
Never really ends.
And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and with the Trump-Kennedy alliance, I think we can get very, very, you know, it's looking very good. So God bless everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Yep. God bless.